recording here. So today, what we want to do, we'll start with Chapter 7. Hey, get your attention.
Sorry.
So we're going to start with Chapter 7 today. What the goal over the next 2 weeks, which I'm kind of labeling Unit 2, we're going to go through Chapters 7 through 12. And if you look at the table of contents, you'll see these are all about this SportsStore application. So that's what we're going to build over the next 2 weeks. It's kind of an e-commerce sort of site. So you're going to see how those parts fit together. In fact, today we're going to integrate that first database. So you're going to actually get to see a database finally and see Entity Framework and tying that together. So yay. That database only, as far as what I can tell, only has one table. It's relatively simple. We'll want to build on that a bit. So as we go through, once we finish that, there's some additional stuff that I want to kind of get into and deal with, because there's some more stuff that you want to know about. But that'll get us kind of started. It will cover a lot of pieces. There are a lot of different pieces that we'll touch as we go through that, and we'll try to elaborate and explain what those pieces are as we go through. If you're reading, as you're reading through the textbook, he'll make a lot of mentions to, hey, by the way, I talk more about this stuff in the next chapters. So you'll see past chapter 12. If you look through this, all of the stuff past chapter 12 is more advanced information about the things that we're going to cover in the application. So there may be things that just like, oh, here's the code for it. If you really want to know how it works, you may want to go and read that associated chapter. So fair forewarning, we're going through chapters 7 through 12, but there may be some additional reading that you want to do in those future chapters, pick and choose, based on topics that you're kind of like, oh, I want to find more about that. So that's the goal for these next 2 weeks. We'll do that, and then we'll have another hands-on test in 2 weeks over that kind of stuff. Hands-on written test. So this is going to be a lot more hands-on focused over the next 2 weeks. You know, our first 2 weeks were more focused on theory. This is going to be more focused on, let's build this application, and then we'll come back and we'll do some more advanced things from there. So I'm going to jump into chapter 7 here. We're going to start building this up. Now, one note he makes about there's a bunch of sections like this that mention, hey, unit testing, right? And the reason that he's called these out is he's trying to kind of make this stuff optional. Like, if you don't necessarily want to do unit testing, you don't want to go through that, you can skip it. We'll be skipping that. Fair forewarning, there's a lot of that stuff through chapters 7 through 12. We'll be skipping over that unit testing sections just to try and keep things simple at this point in the process. Does that make sense? If you want to read through those, be my guest. But just a fair forewarning, I'm going to be skipping over those pieces. It does also mean that I will be doing some things differently in the sense that I'm not going to be using inject. He does use inject, and that's part of the way you need to support unit testing to do the mocking bits, but we'll be skipping over that to keep that simple. Okay. So I've already written kind of the code the way I'm going to build it. So I have that off to the side. You may see me copy and pasting code in. You'll see, hey, all of a sudden you have a block of code. Well, that's because I already have it written off to the other side. So I'm going to try and be at the pace where everybody can get a chance to type it in. We'll just kind of try to keep that pace, but I'm going to do that to try and make sure that people aren't waiting for me to type, if that makes sense. Okay, so SportsStore. Let's get this started. So I'm going to open up Visual Studio. I'm going to go create a new project. I'm going to pick that ASP.NET web application. I'm going to call this SportsStore, camel casing as such. I'm going to go ahead and put this under see, I want to do this under labs, unit 2 lab. That's where I'm going to put this. So I'm going to put this under labs, unit 2 lab. I'm going to call the project SportsStore. We'll be working through this same project all through from chapter 7 through 12. If you want to take it back up along the way, feel free, but I only want that one project. I want it to be one project when you're done with chapter 12. So that's where we're going. Anybody else? Anybody still need that? Everybody's still missing that? No. Okay. So we're going to hit create. Just like previously, I'm going to pick empty, and I'm going to check the MVC box. Okay. So let's go ahead and hit create on that. Okay, so we got an empty project. The next few things we want to do now, one note here. As he creates it in the book, there's 3 separate projects. So there's a domain project, a web UI project, and a unit test project. We're going to do this all as, it's going to end up being 2 projects, but it'll be kind of different, if that makes sense. So we're going to create this what would be the web UI project, and then we're going to tack on another project for the database. So we've got this main project here. The thing I want to do next is go ahead and install some projects. Okay, he's got a bunch of projects here. We're doing it over the command line. There's 2 different. One thing to know about Nuget. Nuget's a way to kind of bring in third-party code that somebody else has written and you want to use. There's 2 different ways to get to it. Okay, so the first way to get to it is to go to open the package manager console, which I don't remember where that is. So if you go to Tools, Library, Package Manager, Tools, and I think they have moved it since then. Tools, Library, Package Manager. Yeah. So I believe that they have moved that since the book was printed. But it's here. So Tools, Nuget Package Manager Console. So if you go through that, you'll get a window like I have at the bottom that will come up. Okay. So you can use this to do all the Nuget fancy stuff with in Visual Studio, and sometimes that may be easier, especially if you're working with a lot of projects and you're trying to automate things and such. There is some versatility there, but to try and keep things simple, I'm going to actually be using the GUI front end to install the packages. So to do that, I'm going to right click on SportsStore. I'm going to say Manage Nuget Packages. Okay. You'll see that there's 3 tabs up top. So there's Browse. That's to go install new things that we haven't installed previously. Installed will show me what's already installed. And then Updates, I can see, okay, there's something I have installed, but there's a newer version up there available for it. So the first thing I want to do is go ahead and update the .NET compiler. So I'm going to go and click that little blue button, say OK. And so now the .NET compiler is up to date. That's the first step I want to do. The next thing I want to do is go over to Browse and look for Bootstrap. I will be using Bootstrap from a CDN, but the reason I'm installing it here is that it will make our IntelliSense work better by going ahead and installing it. So I'm going to go grab the Bootstrap package. I am going to get version 4.3.1. Note the book uses version 3, right? So as we go through, we're going to have to update some of these things to be Bootstrap 4 instead of being Bootstrap 3. or install that. You can see here Bootstrap depends on a few things, right? So Bootstrap requires jQuery and it requires Popper, right? So when I go to install Bootstrap, it's actually going to install all three of those things for me. Okay. Now it's only going to install the minimum version that it requires. At least one of these has an update. So once I go download this, you'll see that there's updates. Let me clear this out. See, there's updates. So I installed version 3 of jQuery and version 1.14 of Popper, but you can see there's already an update for it, right? So here I need to go ahead and update both of those things. I'm going to say select all packages, click the update button. Okay. So what we should have now, you should have Bootstrap 4.3.1, jQuery 3.4.1, you should have Popper 1.14, and we should have your .NET compiler should be up to 2.0.1.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
The Nuget package should be installed.
Yeah.
I'll just make sure that everybody's at the same place I am. Okay, so we've got those packages installed. That's the first step that we need to take care of, is to get those what we call third-party dependencies out of the way. Now we can actually start writing some code. So the first thing I'm going to create is the model. Just like that's a normal place where we start with nearly every project. So I'm going to go to the models folder and say add a new item. I'm going to create a class. It's going to be called product. Okay. Add some properties to that. Now, normally we've added that those required attributes and such to that class at this point. We're going to come back and do that later this time through. So right now, don't put any of those constraints on it, any of those attributes. We're just going to put the properties there first. And this right here, this is page 161 if you're following along with the book. That's roughly where we're at. So that's come off. Next step. So we're going to skip over this product repository. What I want to do is now add the controller. So I'm going to add a controller called product controller. Add controller, product controller. Okay, I need to add the using that. Okay. So I've got a list of products here, and then I've got a single action method called list. We're not filling out all the data for this right now, simply because we'll come back and actually replace that with the database in a minute. So this is just a proof of concept to make sure that this works, which is why we're only setting the name and the price attributes on there. So edit, advanced, format document. Yeah, this is not what I'm doing. That's what's going to get doing something. So follow along with what I've got on the screen, because what's there is going to be good. So I can move things around and kind of simplify the things and upgrade it too. That's an error on my part. So far, nothing new, right? I'm just creating a list. I'm using my collection initializer to set it up, and I'm using the object initializer to set up the individual project. So we've talked about all these kind of pieces already. So I've got a model, I've got a controller. What's probably the next piece that I need to put into place?
View.
The view, okay? So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go over to Views, right-clicked on the product folder. I'm going to say Add. We're going to add a view. Actually, let me go this a different route so I can just show you how to get there. This is actually the quicker route to get there. I'm on the list. If I right-click in here, I can say Add View from there. And it's going to go ahead and call it List. Now, for this particular one, make sure the checkboxes are correct. So we're going to say don't check this is a partial view. Make sure it's checked to use a layout file. Okay. I know we don't have a layout file yet. It's actually going to go and create one for us. We're going to let it do that, and then we're going to go fix that layout file. So let's add the list. Okay. I need to specify what model to use. Any guesses as to what model I'm going to tell it?
The only one we have.
The only one we have. Probably going to use a product. Well, given that my product controller returns a list of products, right, I'm going to make that model be IEnumerable product. Because I have a list of products, because I'm giving it multiple products, right? If I was going to make this view model, if I was going to make this just be a single product that it was going to show, then I would make it just product. But because I want it to show multiple products, I needed to be an IEnumerable of products.
It's in sports. It's an S.
Oh, that's why. Yeah. SportsStore, let me open up the code that I have written for this already. Okay. So I want to give this page maybe a quick, let's remove the title. So I have that. I want to go ahead and change the view bag title here to be products. So that'll be what shows up on top. I want to show more than one product, right? So what's a common next step then, given that? I probably need to loop. Probably need to loop through the products, right? So let's start that out. I'm going to start as a for each loop. So I'm going to say for each item in model.products. Or actually, that should just be model. It should just be model. I'm going to say, well, let's show some information about that product. The way I'm going to write that code is as such. So I'm going to wrap it all in a div. So we have a group for each item. And I'm going to say, okay, name, description, and price. So we should see a list once we're in a minute. Once we run this in a minute, we should see a list of products with their name, description, and price. Yes. How do I what?
Oh, there we go.
Usually I just type at for each and then go for it. I don't have any fancy keyboard shortcuts I use for that typically. But.
Is there any way to get like this highlighting of the razor syntax of the razor code to be like not there?
Sorry.
Okay.
I could maybe go through and change some of the settings, but I'm not going to do that on
Yeah, I was just curious.
right now. It's helpful to have that syntax. It's helpful to have the highlighting just so you know what's razor code and what's not. But
Yeah, that's fair.
Dalton, you're still typing?
I'll just have a comment.
Okay, so that's the basic view we're going to set up there. I'm going to go ahead and make some changes to the layout. You can see the layout that it generated already has a lot of stuff in it. In fact, it's already got Bootstrap, Modernizer, all those kind of things in it. Okay. Now, the thing to know, this particular list nav bar in here, well, that's not Bootstrap 4. That's Bootstrap 3. Okay. You can re-swizzle that and make it work with Bootstrap 4. I would recommend just starting from scratch because there's so many little changes that you have to track to do that. So I'm going to actually just cut everything out of here pretty much. So I'm going to cut everything out of the body. The only thing I want to have there is a main tag with the render body.
What about the scripts?
I'm going to cut those out as well. So the only thing I have left there is the main tag in there, in the body. Okay. That's all my body's going to look like right now. Now, if you're looking at the head section, notice it's going ahead and created a title here, but it's tacked on dash my ASP.NET application. Yeah, you probably don't want to leave that as is, right? We probably don't want to have all the applications we build say my ASP.NET application, right? And in fact, I'm just going to cut that out entirely so that it just says view bag title. So whatever title the view picks, we're going to stick with that. Okay. I'm also going to get rid of these pieces here and just bring in the Bootstrap 4.431 from the CDN. So that's all I have left. Is Bootstrap 4.3.1 from CDN, view bag title, main container, render body. That's all we have left.
You don't need the script tags?
Not right now. Not right now. If you want to go grab them from the Bootstrap website, feel free and add them in there. But for what we're doing, this week, we won't actually need the scripts. We won't need any of the JavaScript for this week. Well, I take that back. We will. We won't need the JavaScript at all this week. We may go back and bring it in at some point, but we don't need it right now. And there's the site CSS from there as well. Reminder, get bootstrap.com because I really want to get that style sheet. Okay. Yeah, just hit that app.
I was looking up spell checkers. Is there a free one? Because all of them are free trials.
I think that we already have installed one. If you follow through the install instructions, I told you to install one.
I did, but I didn't see one. I'll go back and look at that. Because I looked it up.
Because I had you install one, you follow through the instructions.
Crash his computer.
So if you go back to first homework, homework 1A, and look at those install instructions, it's asked you to install certain extensions in the Visual Studio. You're missing. Don't worry about doing it right now. It takes some time. But that's where you'll find that information. There is a specific. This is
Yeah, sure. Like you said.
What happened?
It crashed and
Was it rebooted?
yeah.
Made that crazy noise earlier.
I don't have one with all Visual Studio and everything installed, unfortunately. I don't take yours, so I wish I could give you a better answer. I am recording everything.
Okay.
I'll just go back to it.
Brandon, when you
I wish I had a better answer.
did you just use the free?
Yeah, I don't have an issue.
version of
I'm
it?
gonna take
Yeah.
yours, but,
And what is the actual free version? What do they allow you to do? Isn't there like a threshold how much you can use?
If it is still a problem by the end of class, let me know and we'll try to figure out something for tomorrow. So you have a different machine to work with, but okay. So this is what we have set up here. We've set up the view, we've set up the layout. When we created that, it already created our view start file. So that's already set up there. Okay. And you can see it's pointing at view shared underscore layout because it went and put the underscore layout file into the shared folder. That make sense? So that's the way this is set up. So let's go ahead and run this and see what we're getting. Okay. Now, if I look at it initially here, it's saying, hey, I can't find the page, right? I can't find the page. Because where is it, what is it looking for? So looking for home index, right? So if I just put at the end and I say slash product slash list, there we go, okay? So right now if I try to run it, I'll get a 404 error. If I type in product list, you should see this, right? So it should see a list of names and prices, and that's it, okay? Now, we want to fix that so that the home page actually lands here. The way I'm going to go do that, I'm going to go make a change to the routing file. So under app start, route config, I'm going to go in here and I'm going to change these defaults. This is the way I'm going to work around this right now. I'm going to change this to list, or sorry, product and list. Now, fair forewarning, this is kind of a dangerous thing to change because now I've said, well, the default action for every controller is now list instead of being index, right? So this is not something not the way I would recommend you do this in a real site. But what we're going to do in Chapter 8, we're going to completely redo this whole routing table, and that'll be closer to what I would recommend. That makes sense? So this is a quick patch. We'll go fix it when we come back in Chapter 8 and change this routing table again. Okay. Any questions there? Go ahead and run it. Let's make sure that when we run it, it's going to get us to that main page. So now when you run it, it should be just going to the root. It should give you that page. Anybody not getting that? See, it's not here.
Yeah, I can add that on every single one of them just because
So remember when we're doing razor expressions, you don't typically put semicolons separate. It's only for writing code in a block, like between code braces. Graham, did that solve your problem?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is where we're at. So that puts us around page 167. So the next thing we're going to want to do is set up the database. Now, there is more than one way to crack that nut. There's more than one way to set up the database, okay? The way I'm going to set up this database will be different than the book, okay? It's going to be different than the book, but I'd ask you to use this method for all the projects we do this semester, okay? There is something built into Visual Studio. It's called LocalDB. It's meant for testing. It's meant to be a lightweight version of SQL Server. Unfortunately, I've run into a lot of issues with it as far as with students working with it during the semester, because there are a lot of unfortunate ways where it is different than SQL Server. And unfortunately, what it means is that one of the things that happens too, when I deploy it, I have to deploy it to SQL Server. I can't run it on the actual server as LocalDB. It's not meant to work that way. It's only meant as a testing solution. Well, that means eventually I'm going to have to run these applications on the SQL Server and not LocalDB, right? Well, if you're used to doing LocalDB locally and then it's running on SQL Server when you deploy it, you think there might be some problems in getting it from like working on your machine to working on the server? Well, so what we want to do is we're going to use SQL Server on our local machines to test it with. That way, the way that we deploy it and put it into production, have it live, is the same way we're used to developing it. That makes sense? So you're used to those tools. You don't have to all of a sudden learn them when we go to deploy it. Okay? So what I want to open up is going to be SQL Server Management Studio. You should be able to type in SQL. It should come up like this, Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio. Okay. We're going to run that.
This is what we installed.
Yeah, we installed this day one, so you should already have it. Yeah. So one thing I'm going to do, because we're going to use this a lot, I'm going to go ahead and right-click here, pin it to desktop, because we're going to be using it a decent amount to do different things. So you'll make sure that you have that handy, because real world, spend about as much time in this as I do SQL Server. You know, about 50-50 time. Is that useful? It's enough of a tool in your toolbox to have handy. And know well. So the thing I want to type in here is localhost. Localhost is the name for my own machine, right? Everybody's machine, regardless of what your actual computer name is, you can type in localhost and that refers to yourself. Does that make sense? Okay, so I'm going to type in localhost. I'm going to say I'm going to use Windows authentication, which it means it's going to log in with my Windows credentials. Okay, the other options there I have is these. The main two that we're going to use is either SQL Server authentication or Windows authentication. This is where we're going to start. So, localhost, Windows authentication, hit connect. You'll see on the left that it shows me the server, okay, my server localhost. If I were to connect to other machines, let's say I wanted to connect to another server. You don't need to do this part. This is just demonstrating how this works. So Windows authentication. So if I wanted to get into another server, AWD Rankin server, you can kind of see how that shows up. It's going to show you every server that you're connected to. That makes sense? That's how that's going to look. Okay. So what I want to do is go under the databases folder here, expand that, and in here you'll see that I have a report server database there. You won't have any databases there right now. What you want to do is right-click on the databases folder. And let me emphasize that, right-click on the database folders. If you right-click on any of those other folders, including the system databases folder, you're not going to get what we want. We want to make sure we're just right-clicking here on databases, not system database. Okay, so I'm going to say right-click there, say new database. The name of this database is going to be SportsStore, just like we called the project. So I call that SportsStore, and then you're just going to hit OK. You can leave everything else as the default. Now, one thing that is worth paying attention in there, notice this path section. It's going to actually, this is where we're going to have these files. So if you ever needed to get a backup of the actual database files, this is where they're going to be located, is system program files, Microsoft SQL Server, yada, yada, yada. So if for every reason we need to back it up, transfer it to another computer, that's where that's the folder that those files will be located in. Okay. So we're just going to hit OK. All right. So now we should have a little cylinder symbol here for SportsStore. That's our database. New database, empty database created. There's no data in there. There's no anything. So the way we store data in a database is what we like to use. The way we break it down in SQL Server is we store things in what we call tables. Okay. Tables actually look just like you're familiar with thinking of as a table. It's a table of data. So the way I'm going to create a new table is I'm going to go right-click on the tables folder. You can see that there's no tables in there right now. I'm going to say right-click, new table. You'll see there's a few different options here. I want just the table, new table. Okay. Now, there's two pieces here. You're going to see, okay, well, there's a sort of designer here. Actually, this one's different than what I'm used to. But you're going to see that there's sort of a designer here. Actually, let me jump out of this because I want to do this differently. So that's one way you can do it with the designer. Let's just go through that. You can create this with the designer. The other way to do this is to create it with code. But let's create it with the designer. So, in order to, I need a few different columns. So we're going to say product ID. The data type for that is going to be int. It's not allowed to be null, so I'm going to uncheck that. Let me simplify this. This is going to be easier to go the other way around. I'm just going to skip the designer. Right-click on SportsStore, new query. That's going to be the easiest way to set this up. I'm just thinking about the different things I need to do, and that's going to be easier to do it this way.
You didn't save it, right?
Yeah, I didn't save it. I just threw it away. So I'm going to right-click on SportsStore and say, tables, and say new query. Right-click on SportsStore and go new query. This is where I'm at. Okay. So the code that I want to type into here is this. That's what you want to put in there and run. Please make sure that you give me a chance to double-check it before you run it. Because things in SQL are sometimes a little bit hard to undo. This is a fair follow-up.
So this is SQL here.
This is what we call SQL. Structured query language.
Just copy and paste this from.
Yes, it's actually it's the same.
So
you can copy and paste it.
DDO,
That's exactly
running the
right.
DDO at the top. Okay. So it's on page.
That's exactly right.
172.
That's exactly right.
Why is everything caps?
So, generally keywords in SQL, and this is what we're seeing here now is SQL. Let me go ahead and make it a little bit larger. 172. Yes, this is 172. In SQL, all the keywords are actually generally written as caps. They're generally written all uppercase. Okay. They are not required to. All these keywords I could write in lowercase or uppercase. Case actually doesn't matter as a general rule in SQL. It's actually usually case insensitive as a general rule of thumb. The reason that they are all uppercase, right? All the programming that you've done so far, right? Most of it's been lowercase, right? Most of it's been lowercase. JavaScript, C#, generally you do lowercase. Is that correct? Okay. Well, that's kind of the modern way to do things. And given that JavaScript and C# are relatively newer languages, well, that's the way things are done now. SQL is a very old language. SQL is a very, very old language. Let me stress that. And that's part of where this comes from. So back in the, say, 80s, 60s, somewhere in that range, 60s, 80s, most programming languages didn't really have the concept of case. And so there wasn't really a lot of that, oh, okay, you can, paying attention to case sensitivity. That was pretty common. And having things all uppercase was pretty common because maybe we didn't have shift keys. Maybe we didn't have that kind of thing. So this used to be, writing everything uppercase used to be the standard for all programming languages, actually. You go back to old Fortran, you go up to basic, you see, oh, everything's uppercase, right?
Ada.
Yeah, so it used to be this way for everybody. Everything used to be uppercase. That's where this comes from. Now, I don't have that problem, and I would to some sense suggest if you're writing SQL code, you probably want to do it all lowercase. Write all the keywords lowercase just because it's easier. The IntelliSense and formatting tools, though, in Visual Studio will suggest that you do it in uppercase. Does that make sense? So as you're doing the IntelliSense, it'll automatically generally change it to uppercase, which is where we just kind of usually stick with that, if that makes sense. Microsoft's going to force it into being uppercase even though it doesn't.
Is the primary key identity?
So let's go through this. Okay, so each of these rows that I have here represents a column. So we're going to say create a table, and in order to and we're going to say call the table products, okay? Remove that word DBO because it doesn't matter. We're going to call it products. Each of these represents what we call a column. Think about a table. What do I mean by that? If I say I've got a table, grab a different marker. Maybe I have ID, A1, first name, last name. So maybe I call this the person table. So I say 1, 2, this may be John Doe, okay. So I have a table like this, right? We call that a table. We call each of these columns, we have rows. So our data is stored as rows. Does that make sense? Each row that we have in the table represents a thing. Okay? We call this a relational database. Relational databases are stored as tables and relationships between tables. Okay? Every one of these boxes here that we have, we call that a cell or a field. You'll find both of those words in the literature, cell or field. Okay, so rows, columns, tables, cells, and fields. So database can have any number of these tables that we want. But that's basically everything that we build is tables. Okay? Now, one important thing to know with tables, tables don't support arrays inside of them. They all have to be what we call scalar values. Okay? So I can't say, oh, okay, let's add what might be one thing that I want to add that has more than one value. Well, maybe phone numbers, right? Maybe they have more than one phone number, right? Phone numbers. I can put a single phone number in here. That's all fine. I can put a single phone number in here. But I can't put multiple phone numbers in that same column. I can't put an array. Everything that I put in a cell has to be a single value. Okay? So that's going to make things, there's going to, because of that idea that we can't put arrays directly there, is going to mean that we have to do a little bit more fancy footwork once we want to start having, well, I want to have these objects, right? For instance, when we created your resume, when we were working on your portfolio, we have tags. We have tags on your projects. Well, that array of tags is array of strings. I can't directly represent that as a single table. Does that make sense? So once we want to have arrays inside of our objects, we're going to have to start adding more tables. Or I want to say my product, well, it has multiple photos, right? I can put one column in here for that single picture, but if I want to have more than one picture for my products, I'm going to have to do something different. Okay? So that's a thing to keep in mind as we go forward. Okay? We'll have to do something a little bit more advanced if we want to have our products have more than one photo.
So you're saying you can have like nested tables or something? Like tables inside tables?
You can't have nested tables. Those don't exist. You can't have nested tables. What we can have is related tables. So I can draw a connection between one table and another table. But we won't do that yet.
Is it a common workaround with that problem of like not being able to store like an array? Kind of like converting an array like by data? Or like
that's something you don't want to do. That's something you absolutely don't want to do because the performance is basically nil.
Oh, really?
That's,
Okay.
yeah, it's garbage if you try to do that.
All right, fair enough. Yeah.
And performance is a very, let me be clear, performance on database is an important thing.
Right.
Because it's usually our main bottleneck is going to be the database. As far as
Okay.
running websites fast, the main bottleneck is always the database. So the way we deal with that is important. NoSQL databases, as you're familiar with, deal with that problem a little bit differently. But we won't be touching too much on that today in this course. Okay. So that's the basic terminology of how that's set up. So what this is going to create is going to create a table with 5 columns. Okay? A table with 5 columns. So first column being product ID, next one being name, description, category, price. So you can see the names of the columns are there in brackets. It's the first thing we put in there. The next thing that you'll see is the type of that column. Okay? So the product ID is an integer. Should be actually is the same type that you're used to working with in C#. It's a 32-bit integer. Nvarchar. Okay, let's break that down. So char for character, right? It's saying that this can hold character data. Okay. If I just put char here, that would say that I want a column that holds exactly 100 characters. Never less, never more. It's always exactly 100 characters. Okay? Might that be a problem for our names? Right? They're probably going to need to be variable length, right? So if I want something fixed length, I can put char there, but if I want something that's variable length, I need to add var. So varchar is a variable length string of characters, or a string as you're used to, right? Now, in that case, this 100 says it can be 100 characters or less. That's a limit to the number of characters that you can put in that field. Does that make sense? Why is that important? Why do we want to limit the number of characters that we save, that you can put in here?
Saving more characters would require more space.
Would require more space, potentially. Right? What if I say, I'm going to reserve 1,000 characters, but the longest thing I have is 5 characters long, right? Now I've wasted a bunch of space for every single row, right? I'm wasting space. So I want these to be as low as I can, because that's going to make things run faster. Okay? The tighter limits I put on here, it's going to be faster, and take less storage space. But the downside is I don't want those to be so small that the users can't type in what they need to. Right? These limits are probably higher than they need to be, but that's what the limits are here. Okay? Now, varchar versus nvarchar. Okay? That little n is actually pretty important. Okay? So if there is no n there, it's just varchar or char. That says that it's going to be stored in ASCII. Without the n, it's stored in ASCII. What does that mean? Anybody can tell me what that means. You may or may not have heard that term.
Isn't ASCII like it's like a type of almost conversion to like a universal? Yeah. Okay. Cool.
So ASCII is a set of 128 characters, all of which are on your keyboard. Are there characters on your Are there characters that are out there that aren't on your keyboard? Yeah, there are, right? Chinese characters are not on your keyboard. Certain Spanish characters are not on your keyboard. Certain German characters are not on your keyboard. There's a lot of foreign language characters that are not on our keyboard. ASCII is English only. ASCII only supports the English. That 128 characters, those are only the ones that are normally on that English speakers would use. Okay. So if I just put car or var car, I can't support any other language than English. Okay. What putting the N there lets me do is lets me support any language that's out there. That's the big difference. English only or everything. Okay? Now, the thing to know there, once I put without that in, if it's just varchar, every character only takes up 8 bits of space. Okay, only takes up a byte. Once I go to put the N there, every character takes up 2 bytes. Okay, so it does double, potentially anywhere from double to quadruple the amount of space that's needed to store that column. Okay. For things like this, name description, that trade-off is worth it, because at some point you may want to have Chinese products in there, or you may want to run this code. You know, maybe it's run in China, and they want to have their products there and have it be in Chinese, right? So anything that could potentially be translated at some point, I'm going to put the N there. Does that make sense? Anything that could be in a language that's not English, we're going to say N varchar, and that's most things. Okay? So name, description, category, obvious things that could be different languages. Okay? Now, notice that there's different lengths. Part of that is looking at category. Categories are usually pretty short, so they're only giving 50 characters for them at max. Name is also pretty short, 100 characters. Description, you can see, has a lot more. Description has a lot more because descriptions are generally longer. So does that make sense? So that name, the length of characters, we want to make that as small as we can, but we also need to allow for reality as different things have different lengths.
So you're using varchar for strings?
And varchar. Yep. So anything that we have as a string in our models is generally going to be represented as an n varchar in the database. Does that make sense? Now, there's an important distinction there, right? Do strings have an upper length, maximum length? They don't, right? Strings don't have a maximum length. So we'll have to do a little bit of finagling because of that, right? Because on the database, all of our strings have a maximum length, whereas when we're running when we're in the world of C#, they don't, right? And in fact, one thing to know for the mapping. So we've got a few different types here that we can have on the server side. You may want to write these down. So we have car. These are all ways to kind of store strings. Varchar. And text. These are all the ASCII versions. These are all ASCII data types that we can store things in there. We'll also have the same ones with an N in front of them. So these are Unicode, these are ASCII. All of those 6 types map to a string in our model. Okay? All 6 of those get represented as strings in our model. Okay? So there's not really a one-to-one ratio between relationship between a string and these types. Does that make sense? They're similar, but there are some differences.
How do you spell ASCII, like ASCII?
It's 2 I's. ASCII. ASCII. Sorry, it's not spelled as it sounds. So those ones on the left are ASCII. The ones on the right are Unicode. Unicode. And specifically, they're typically stored as Unicode or UTF-16. Yeah, UTF-8 is a byte per character. UTF-16 is 2 bytes per character. Typically on the database, they're stored as, these nvar cars are stored as UTF-16, if I remember right. Now, comparing that ASCII, Unicode, does anybody remember how strings in C# are stored? What is each character? How big is each character?
Isn't it right?
Not quite. It's 2, right? In C#, every character is 2 bytes for UTF-16. So actually, in memory, we're going to be storing, regardless of whether it's ASCII or UTF-16, UTF-8, regardless of how it's stored on the database, when we bring it into C#, they will be stored as Unicode. Okay. So the savings, right, as far as savings in space, is only on the database side, right? You won't actually be saved if you're creating the type as car, var, text, any of these 3, you're only saving data on the database side. You're not saving data once it comes to C#, because it has to be expanded to Unicode. That make sense? The other thing that means is there's a translation overhead if we put it in here. There's a cost anytime we come into C# because it has to be changed from one thing to another. That makes sense? So that's where you're usually going to see an N at the beginning. Okay? And that's why it's important. That's why the N at the beginning is important, because otherwise all I can support is English, right? Which may not seem a big deal in this course, right? But when you get into the industry, being able to support more languages than just English is kind of important, right?
So, like, in what case would you want to use inchar or inchar instead of in bar car? Like, why not just use bar car all the time?
So this is fixed length, right? This is variable length, okay? There are some things in the real world that have a fixed length. What kind of things in the real world have a fixed length?
Phone numbers and credit card numbers.
Sort of, yes.
Social Security.
Yes. So phone numbers typically have a fixed length, sort of. Here's the problem with phone numbers. Remember area codes?
Yeah.
So if I say 555 1234, let's just say I ignore the dashes for a moment. I can have a 7-digit phone number. I can have a 10-digit phone number, or I can have an 11-digit phone number. These are all the same phone number, aren't they? If I call those, if I dial that, will I get the same person?
Probably.
Depends on where you live. Depends on where you live, right? If I use this one, I will always get the same person regardless of what country I'm in, because the 1 stands for US. So I always get the same person if I dial that number. This, I don't have that area code at the beginning, so depending on where I dial it from, I may get a different person on the end of the line.
So fill it with whatever the area code of the phone you're using is.
So what I mean by that, the other thing, well, so the one way to work around that is if I'm going to say I'm going to use this fixed length and I'm supporting the US, right? My phone numbers should be 11 characters long, right? They shouldn't be 7 characters long. They need to be 11 characters long. Because otherwise you're going to get some data that's like this, some data that's like that, some data that's like this, and then that becomes kind of a nightmare to manage, right? So if I'm going to make these a fixed length, I would need it to be 11 characters long, right? Now, other countries, not so simple. Places in England, different people have different, depending on where you live, you have a different length of phone number. They're not all the same length phone number. Whereas we here, we say, okay, well, your basic is 7 or 10 characters, right? 7 or 10 digits. That doesn't exist in Britain and several other countries where they have variable where some people may have a 3-digit phone number, other people might have a 5-digit phone number, other people might have a 7-digit phone number, okay? So actually for phone numbers, I would recommend still using a variable length because there's so much discrepancy between different countries and cultures and localities. I would recommend be safe and give a variable length as far as your database is concerned, but be very strict on the front end with how they type it in. Does that make sense? So for phone numbers, you want all that logic on the front end, but to be very general on the back end is typically how that works out. Now, social security numbers. Okay. Are social security numbers fixed length?
In the US they are.
Well, social security numbers, do they exist in any other countries?
Yes, they do.
It's a different system though.
Different system, and they're not called social security numbers. They're called something else, right? Now, having a common a national identification system that's something that a lot of countries have. Not all of them do necessarily. But as far as the US is concerned, we have a standard and it's a certain fixed length. So if I know that if I'm taking social security numbers, if I'm using those at all, then I should be US only, inherently. You know, inherently by using social security numbers, I've kind of boxed myself in the hole where I'm saying, oh, I'm doing something that's probably already, for some other reason, it's probably specific to the US. Okay, which is where if you can avoid it, you just don't deal with them in the first place. But that would be a good place to use varchar, right? And say if I need an identification from another country, I might put that in a different column. Because it could be that somebody, especially if, let's say they're a dual citizen, let's say they're a citizen of the US and France, right? They would have a social security number for the US and they would have another number for France. Does that make sense? You'd actually have more than one number. One person could. So I want to, if I'm talking about a social security number, yes, that would be a good case for it having a fixed length. Okay. What's another case that we have that are common fixed length? Most of these do arise with numbers. Something we call numbers.
Credit card numbers.
Credit card numbers, yes, are usually fixed length.
Birthday could be.
Birth dates were, in theory, are fixed, but we actually will store those as dates or date times. So, sorry, we will actually store those in a column called date. So, birth date, we actually have a different type for it. So, yes. So, zip codes would be another example. Zip codes, whether they're a 5-digit zip code or a 9-digit zip code, they have a fixed length. Right? So zip codes, you'll usually see a fixed length. The other case that you'll see, ISBN numbers. You know, ISBN number for books, they have a fixed length. Barcodes, depending on what your setup is, may have a fixed length. If we're going back to banking, we talk about routing numbers, those have a fixed length.
License plate.
License plates have fixed length. So there are a lot of things out there.
But vanity plates can sometimes be shorter though.
You're right. They can. They can. And if you're trying to support more than one state, not every state uses the same length of license plate number. But if I'm building a system for just, hey, Missouri license plates, and we'll store vanities somewhere else,
Like it's something like
right, as a separate column, then I could do that. right? So what's common about all those systems where we have a fixed length? What's common, so we've got all these things that can be potentially fixed length. What's common among them? Because there's a few things that are definitely common among all those cases.
Numbers.
They're generally numbers, right? They're generally just number characters. They may sometimes have letters. For instance, ISBN numbers can have an X, okay, as part of the check digit. Or license plates can have letters, right? But they're most commonly numbers, right? Do you think a person comes up with those numbers? Probably not. Most of these numbers are numbers that at some point they were generated by a computer, right? Well, in terms of generating numbers on a computer, generating a fixed length number on a computer is an easy thing, right? So that makes sense. So a lot of times when you see those, it's going to be something where, okay, there's a computer somewhere that was involved or some legislative body. A lot of these things also involve laws, right? A lot of these fixed length numbers involve governments, right? Which also means you have to deal with international issues, right? That's a common thing you're going to see, okay? So all that not to beat a dead horse, but they do occur, right? So you can use varchar everywhere. You can, right? But there are cases that it makes sense to use car. The only reason to use car is there's only two reasons that you ever use car instead of varchar. One is to enforce consistency among your data, right? I don't want to have all these different lengths. So one reason to enforce a fixed length would be to enforce consistency. The other reason to enforce that might be to save storage space or to make things, well, okay, we want to be efficient about that. So those are the two reasons that you might see a fixed length: is performance in terms of data storage and data retrieval, and you might see it because we want to make sure the data is all good, validating the data. Okay. All right, so we've got an integer, we've got varchar, we've got decimal. Decimal is an interesting one. Notice that I've got two numbers here, 16, 2. So decimal means that I'm storing something in base 10, okay? 0 to 9. All the digits are 0 to 9. That first 16 says that the whole thing has 16 digits. It's always going to have 16 digits. However we store this, it's going to have 16 digits in base 10. Okay? The 2 says how many of those 16 are after the decimal point, right? How many of those 16 are after the decimal point? So what this means is I will have 14 digits before the decimal point and 2 digits after. Okay? Why do I want 2 digits after?
Because we're dealing with money.
We're dealing with a price, right? We're dealing with a U.S. price. Okay, we're dealing with an American price. So, fair forewarning, anytime you get into currencies, that number of decimal places is something that depends on which country you're talking about. So, for instance, some countries don't have cents. Most do. Many countries have cents or some version of it, but not all countries do. That make sense? And that should be pretty safe. 16 digits overall means 14 digits on the front end. That's probably actually more space than I need, right? But that's okay. So that's one thing to watch. If I was going to, the reason this works, right, this is stuff I'm selling. We're making this for an e-commerce site, right? So that's probably an upper limit. That's way more than a customer's probably going to pay for any individual item, right? But really what I need to take an account for here to make things simple, I want to actually have that be enough to hold the most expensive total cost of their order, if that makes sense. So even if maybe they're buying 3 items that are $1 million a piece. Well, I need to be able to store 3 million, not just $1 million, not just the price of a single item, but the price of all the items they might have put in their shopping cart. So make sure I have enough space for that, because otherwise I'm going to run into some issues, because I still need to do the math in that same type.
So that surfboard product, or that surfboard product, for example, would be stored with like 12 zeros, 79.00.
Yep. There's going to be a lot of wasted zeros.
Okay.
But that's okay, because again, when I want to add up everything in the shopping cart, I want to keep that in the same type, which means that I actually need to account for how big might their actual total order be. But yes, there's a bunch of extra zeros there. Okay. Now that might not work if I'm dealing with bank accounts or investment funds or things like that, where people have many millions of dollars potentially in those accounts, right? So you do have to adjust that based on what you're working with. You have to know, what is the domain, what are your customers what's the world that they live in, right? That's not something you can determine just looking at the code. Okay. So
That might be a good time for a break.
yeah, let's go ahead and take a break here. Go ahead and take a break here.
Just one quick thing. Yes. My format doesn't quite many errors, but maybe data. So I'm just going to and when we're looking at this teaching integration called edited advanced format. It says selected, so control A. I don't usually do formatting things, so we just do it. When I create my tables, I typically create them actually Visual Studio. Okay. Visual Studio is like a great stuff. Oh, really? Yeah. Because it was working fine yesterday. We were trying to get the project started, and I crashed my whole computer. So what did you do that got you into the installer? How did you end up in the installer?
I tried clicking on the icon inside Go to install. Because
So you saw the message that was saying what was rebooting? That was checking hard copy. So whatever happened, you lost power, right? Did you have this come out? Because that sounds like that might have come out. It might have had
It came out once, but the battery was full of charge instead.
Okay. So what that tells me there, it looked like you had a hard drive actual problem, like some missing on hard drive that. And that's a symptom of that. So yeah. So sometimes that can be just a case that loses power suddenly. That usually doesn't happen when Windows crashes. It can, it usually doesn't. So one thing I would recommend, make sure anything you have on this computer you have backed up somewhere else. Because once that starts happening, it can be a matter of like in a month it's gone. Just a fair forewarning. Once hard drives start failing, they usually fail pretty catastrophic. Shortly thereafter.
For a new computer.
So yes, definitely. Well, save up for a new hardware.
No, I just want a whole new computer. That's like a
Look at it. New computer or new hard drive, either way. Point is, a new hard drive is like $100 versus 2,000, $1,000 to 2,000 for a new computer. So that's why I say you could make it work. Just make sure you don't have anything that's so.
Well, at least not an important.
Yeah. So anything you do for classwork, make sure it's up on it for me, or if it's for another class, especially for Gen Eds. Okay. Well, if you ever had something for Gen Eds, come up. sure it's on Google Drive or somewhere else that's not in there, if you have that. So, what we could try, you tried this retry already?
No.
You tried to install it? Oh, okay. Let's give it a try, because otherwise you're gonna have to uninstall it. Yeah. Unfortunately, I don't have a way around that. Ain't no magic fix button. Hard drive failure is a no laughing matter. This is why I told this guy not to hold the power button. Because this problem that you're dealing with right now can happen if you just hold the power button for a minute.
So I should tell everyone at work to stop doing that. Or I could just let them destroy our entire POS system and watch me just laugh.
That's really neat.
That way I can stay on the clock and then.
So, just fair forewarning, yeah, this kind of problem can happen if you disconnect from power supply. Whether you pull the battery out, pull the power cord out, whatever.
It just dies.
Pull the power button, it just dies. We just didn't get a chance to write everything to the system that it needed to write to the system. And so, or files got corrupted in the process. So, all it takes is one file being missing or having a few bad bytes in it, and it won't work. It only takes a few stray bytes for this to be wrong. So, we'll see if it works. That's the best thing I can say is let's retry it. If it doesn't go through, now Windows Restore Point, that is an option. You could go back to setting or Windows Restore Point. You might be able to go back before it crashed. That is I saw that message on your machine reading. I was like, oh. So, this is one of, you're not the first person that I've seen this happen to. This is why I tell people check in every day. Every few hours is best. Because you never know when something like that's going to happen. You never know. You never know who you are. At least Windows is running.
Kind of. Not well, but it's fine.
But it's running. Did it give you a safe boot option at the beginning?
No.
Or-
It's just went straight to that.
Okay. So it's trying. Hopefully it'll fix itself here. But yeah, if it doesn't fix itself,
Uninstall me, so.
yeah. One thing you can do, it's built into Windows as far as hard drive failure goes. It can be a case of something just went weird, and so it's not going to manifest itself again. It would just be a software problem. But hardware, general, but often enough if there's, yes, honestly, it's usually a hardware problem, not a software problem. It might just be something wrong. If you right click on the drive, you put a heavy caveat on there to probably, I'm going to show you where the setting this thing is.
Don't use it.
I wouldn't recommend using it, because last time I did it on a laptop that I was going out, the hard drive was going out, running, it was the last leg of that laptop. Like, I ran it to, so there's a check disk thing that you can go in here to say, okay, go find the sectors that are bad, and then quarantine mark them off limits so we never use those sectors again. Well, unfortunately, in order to do that scan, it has to hit the hard drive pretty hard. And unfortunately, when it did that for me on one of my work laptops, it actually meant that the whole drive was.
Before we do that, I want to back up some pictures.
So I I would not recommend you use that tool. Just know you're there. If you're looking for solutions online,
Don't use that
They
one.
may suggest doing a check disk.
Would throwing the laptop in a river be a better option?
Well, that's a guaranteed loss of data. So, like, guaranteed loss of data versus high likelihood of loss of data.
What's the difference at that point?
So anyway, there is a checklist option you can get in the right-click menu there. I would recommend against using it.
I was going to back up with that. Good too.
Oh, okay. So properties.
And then don't click that.
Don't click
Another one of those last,
It's like-
worst case scenario thing.
Well, Windows put it in there for that scenario to try and, it's a diagnostic tool to see if anything's wrong with the drive. Unfortunately, we have to check it goes through and it tries to read and, check
So
every
if I
piece
start
of
to see
it.
smoke coming out of my computer, we could assume it's them. Or at least parts of it.
The screen's still on, it's probably okay.
As long as they don't release the factory installed smoke.
Yeah, they call it the blue smoke. And it makes everything run. You start losing the blue smoke, the computer stops working. So, just make sure everything's backed up. That's what I would tell you. Hopefully Visual Studio fixes itself and it doesn't manifest itself. But that's enough a reason for me to have a backup machine ready to go. And a very good reason to be putting things on source control, because like, oh, okay, I lost my
Everything.
I lost everything, except that it's all the important stuff's out online, so I can get it again.
That's a good idea.
You know, I can't tell, what you have on your head? So,
Stuff in the way I don't want to lose it.
absolutely.
Well, considering this program right here is really good, I don't want to lose that program.
Okay.
And it's a one-time purchase. There's one of these radar programs I have.
Oh, the radar.
One. I use it. $50. Yay!
Answer that question.
Did you save, this SQL file under anything specific?
I'm not going to save it right now. I'll show you in a minute how I'm going to save it. I'm actually going to save it. Not for Visual Studio. I'm actually going to save it in SQL. Sorry, Visual Studio. So we'll get to that. Just keep it.
You got an external hard drive table?
Nope.
No?
Guess who's getting one?
Cheaper than a home computer.
I kind of want a whole new computer.
like made by Amazon, and it goes hand in hand with all that S3 stuff. It uses NoSQL too. It's really sort of Mongo. It's like tailored towards like Amazon, like Lambda applications and stuff like that.
There's like a nice simple language.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's get back here. So we talked about the data types, right? Data types are an important thing to pay attention to because they do have a big impact on your performance in terms of how fast the application runs, and they do have a big impact in terms of like they actually can impact your end users, right? So for instance, if you say that the longest first name I can have is 5 characters, do you think that might be a problem for some of your users? If the longest first name they can put in is 5 characters. So this can, in effect, it can affect your end users, right? And that's the thing to recognize. Even though that this is the farthest back, this is like the farthest back data access layer. When we're talking about databases like this, these may seem like minor choices. They can have a big impact on your users. Okay?
So if that's the case, would we do that validation still in the controller, or would it be on the model then?
It's still going to be on the controller.
Okay.
Still going to be on the controller. We are going to add some additional attributes in there to talk about the lengths of things, but we're still going to do a lot of stuff with the controller. So we talked about the types. The next part, not null. So if I leave this off, if I leave this section off, and I don't say not null, that means the column can be null. That makes sense? If I don't say not null, that means the column can be null. Similar thing, if I put just the word null, that says the column can be null. Okay? I need to make sure I put not null there. Okay? Otherwise, any of these columns are allowed to be null. The user is not required to put a value in there. Okay, so if it's optional, yeah, we want to allow null, but most of the time we want to say, oh, you can't leave this field blank. Most of these fields will be required. Okay. So that's what that third part is about. Now, notice that the first column has these 3 extra words: primary key identity, right? Notice that none of the other columns have those words. See that? None of those other columns have those words. Okay. Every table we create has to have a primary key. Every table we create has to have a primary key. That primary key is used to uniquely identify the row, or the record, as we would say. We need to have some way to uniquely identify every record in our table and say, I want specifically this record, right? What would be the problem if I don't have that, and maybe I have a table that just has first name and last name?
Something with the same name.
Right. So I have these 2 people, they have the same first and last name. I have 2 John Does. I can't tell the database which row, which record I want to work with because I don't have a unique identifier, right? I need to be able to say, I want you to change or delete or modify this row, right? Which means I need to have a unique identifier for every row. Okay? So every table we create needs to have a primary key. Okay? That's very important. Okay? Now, identity does something additional. Okay? Identity is something we can only put on the primary key column. We can't put it on any other columns. You only ever have one column in a table that has identity. Okay? That only ever goes on the primary key column. Okay? Identity also only works as long as the data type is an integer. Okay? Identity only works if the data type is an integer. What it will do is it will automatically assign IDs. It'll automatically assign IDs for these records. It'll take care of that for us. It'll automatically figure out what those IDs should be. It typically starts out at 1 and then goes up from there. Okay, so usually the first ID assigned is 1 and then it goes from there. There can be gaps, okay? There can be gaps. It may be 1, 4, 7. That's okay. The rule is once you use an ID, you can never use it again, even if you delete that data. So if I ever have a row that might have got inserted as 2, I can never have a 2 again. Even if I delete row 2, I cannot have a 2 again. Okay, so that's where you may see that there may be gaps in your IDs. Make sense? It won't always be 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. Okay. They also aren't necessarily guaranteed to be created in ascending order. Okay. There may be cases where they're in the table and it's 4, 3. Okay, instead of 3, 4. So don't rely on the order of it. It generally will be in ascending order. There generally won't be gaps, but it happens often enough that there are gaps or things out of order that you don't want to rely on that behavior. That make sense? So identity takes care of automatically assigning those IDs. If I left off the word identity, I now in my C# code have to figure out those IDs. I now have to figure out, okay, let's give this user ID 3. Oh, wait, but ID 3 is already taken. I have to deal with all that in my code, right? If I put the word identity there, then the database will deal with figuring out those IDs. It's still not perfect, but it will do a lot better job than I could ever do in my C# code. So that's one way to set that up. The other way, just so you know, there is another way to set up primary keys. Okay. The other way to do this, I'm going to remove the word UUID and put the word GUID. These are called globally unique identifiers. Okay. These are very long. These are very long. They take up quite a bit of space. Why is it giving me an error? Do I have? I have the wrong name there, don't I? Oh, no, it's a unique identifier. And I'm misspelling like crazy right now. There. That's the one I want. What? Oh, it's no underscore. That's why. The SQL Server is different. Okay. So unique identifier. If I put that in there, that's going to tell it to use a GUID, something that's roughly, if I remember right, it's about 128 bits in size. It's randomly assigned when I use those. Those are randomly assigned rather than being 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. They're not assigned in order. They're assigned randomly. Okay, but that's also why we need a much bigger number to make it work. Because we want to randomly assign, we have a very low probability of getting the same number twice. So with 128 bits, that's very, very low, close to impossible. But you'll get the same number twice. Okay. What might be the benefit of assigning IDs randomly over assigning them sequentially?
Like, if you do it sequentially, like you will be able to find, like say if like a hacker or something, will be able to find each product they want and get all your products from the database.
Yeah.
Because they have each ID.
Because I could go, if they're assigned sequentially, I can go ask for ID 1, and then ID 2, and then ID 3, and then ID 4. I can just ask for them until I say, well, I haven't seen any. I've tried all these IDs. The last 100 have not given me any results. I've probably seen all of them.
they can also get the amount of like products you have.
Right.
So they know how
If
much
I know the
sales
highest
are.
ID,
Yeah.
if I know the highest ID is 1 million, I know you have roughly 1 million products.
Yeah.
Or if I know the highest user ID you have is 1 million, I know you have roughly 1 million users. Right? So that, using that identity column that way can be very dangerous from a securities perspective, because yes, it opens up a lot of exploits where you can just guess IDs and until you get the right one. And having unique identifier, that gives you so many billions of IDs, it's very hard to guess what one might be. So it's not perfect. Users can't. There are still techniques to guess, but it's a lot harder. It's a lot harder to guess. So that's one part of that. The other thing that means, let's say I have a table that's changing. Let's say I have a table that's changing a lot. Okay. A lot of users are putting data in there all the time. Let's say I have 1 million users on my website and they're all creating a row every few minutes, right? Well, that's going to create a bottleneck if I use an identity column, because they have to come in sequentially. I have to handle them in some order. I can only handle one customer at a time, one user at a time. So using an ID there, an identity column there, can be very slow with a lot of users creating data. Okay, where might you see that come up, where you have a lot of data coming in?
I was gonna ask a question.
Okay.
So with the last thing that you just described, the last situation you described, would async and await not fix that?
No. Because you still have to, on the database side, that all happens on the C# side. Async is solving problems on the server side, it's running in C#, but it doesn't solve it on the C# side. I mean, it's on the SQL side, on the database side.
Okay.
It doesn't solve it on the back end. They still have to wait for each other.
Didn't your question, like when there's a new site launch or something, everyone would sign up at once?
What do a lot of people do on Facebook? What's the most common thing for people to do on Facebook? Post?
Browse.
But what's more common than posting, actually? Liking.
Even video?
Liking. Recognize that every single time that you press the like button, it has to now create something in the database, something new. Every time you push that like button, it now has to add a row to the table. So you got millions of users all pressing the like button at the same time. And if I'm using an identity column, they'll have to wait for each other's likes to go through. So I might use a unique identifier there to make it so that a lot more users can be handled at the same time. Make sense? So where I have a lot of data, unique identifier is a lot better. Where I have securities constraints, that can be a lot better. The other thing that happens, what if I need to transfer data from one server to another? And that may seem like a crazy thing, wanting to transfer data from one server to another. The one thing you need to know about real-world software development. So we've got the database out there live with the user's real data, right? This is the live site that everybody, if you go to facebook.com, you see the real site, right? Do you think that Facebook builds their software on the live site and tests it on the live site? Probably not, right? So most companies, they'll have a live database and live server, but they also have what we call a development server, development environment. That server will do our testing on. And that way different people in the team can kind of try that system and see it and make sure it works before it goes live. Well, sometimes I need to transfer data from that development environment to the live environment. It's a common case where this happens. It also may be that I have more than one development environment and I need to transfer it between development environments. Okay, well, if the numbers are sequential, I'm assigning them using this identity column. Transferring data is actually a huge pain in the butt. Because usually, okay, I want to copy this one row or these few rows and copy them and move them over here. Okay, well here on this database it was 4, it's ID 4. Well, over here 4 is already taken. 4 is some other data item. So I have to insert it, and now they all have new IDs once I transfer between servers, right? Well, unique identifier, there's enough of them. Usually I can transfer data from one server to another and not change the IDs. That makes sense? So 3 reasons to use a unique identifier for your IDs is going to be A, for security. We're going to use them potentially for handling a lot of data incoming, and we may also use them for what reason?
Migrating databases.
Migrating databases. That is the formal word. So we're going to have those. There are reasons to use that. Okay. Keep that in your back pocket. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and build this using the identity because that's the way the book does it. But if it were me, I would be using a unique identifier there. So does that make sense? That's just something to keep in mind. MongoDB just uses unique identifiers for everything off. They just use GUID for everything off the bat because it's just better when at scale. So, but most resources you find working with SQL Server will use that identity column, even though it's not really the best. So that's just one thing to know there. So I've got it typed in here. You'll see I have a little green execute button here. Looks a lot like your execute button from Visual Studio. Assuming everything's good, let's go ahead and hit execute on this.
Do you have to save it?
Nope, don't have to save it. So we executed it. You should see something like this. Commands committed successfully. Does everybody have that message? Everybody have that message?
No.
What does yours say, Eston? Okay, so important thing to know in Management Studio, okay, you only have the word int highlighted. The code that Management Studio runs is only the stuff you have highlighted. If you highlight nothing, it will run everything in your SQL. But if you only highlight part of the SQL, it will only run that part of the code. Okay? So what you need to do is not select anything and just hit execute. Because it tried to just run int. That was all it had selected. And it's like, I can't do that. So that's one thing to just be careful with when we're working here. If I only have this line selected, it's only going to run that line and nothing else.
So mine pretty successfully, but now my products table has like an error. Wait a minute, edit that.
That's okay.
Okay.
That's okay. It's saying you can't run that script again because now you have a products table.
Right, okay.
You can't run it again because you already have a products table. So we're going to say refresh here on tables. You should see we now have DBO products, right? All right, we need to put some data in there, okay? So I'm going to right click on that and I'm going to say edit top 2000 rows. You'll see a view like this come up, okay? And here's where we're going to put in the data, okay? If you, huh? You don't have, you have to refresh.
I did.
Okay. says 9 already. Oh, you ran against master. You created it in the master database instead of SportsStore.
Oh, okay, I got you.
So let's go to Nuget Packages.
I think it has, because when I ran it, it popped up where it was
So you want to make sure you're running against
SportsStore. Their PayPal email and the phone number.
That's brutal.
What? Why didn't do anything?
Yes.
Oh, I just used the API. I used like the packet system.
You're the same person. Okay.
So,
because we unfortunately took the break where we took the break, some of you locked your machines when you left. Unfortunately, when you locked your machines, you may have run into a little bit of a problem because it disconnected from the database. Okay? So one thing you need to make sure, select the database that you're running against up here. If you have master selected and you ran that, you now have a products database. You have a products table in your master database instead of your SportsStore database. So make sure that you have SportsStore selected here when you execute this.
the drop down is grayed out.
You have to make sure you put the cursor into the script. And then you can change it. You won't be able to change it if you don't have it.
So I executed it again.
Yep. So let me just run this to show what would have happened if you have it the wrong way. Let me select over here in master. I'm going to tell it to execute. Okay, that's now created a products table under master. So I need to go to fix that and be very careful about this because you don't want to delete your master database. You delete your master database, I'm going to tell you reinstall SQL Server. Okay. So master database is an important part of SQL Server. If you delete it, you will have problems, major problems. So we want to go in here. If you have that there, it'll be on master tables, products. We want to delete that table because we don't want to have products table under master.
So how did that happen again? Like, you shut off the...
So if you lock your computer, or you get disconnected from the server, when you reconnect, it will make all of these put all these back to master. Because that's the one it picks by default. Now, one way around that if you put the first line of your SQL scripts, use SportsStore, that says switch to this database before you run the code below. So that's one way to kind of keep yourself safe from those kind of things, is to always put the first line to say use this database. Okay. Use SportsStore and then create the table in SportsStore. So that's one way to fix that. All right, so we created that table. Again, now that we have that table under SportsStore, we'll right click and say edit top 200 rows. And here we need to put some data in. I've actually put all the data that we're going to insert up as a CSV under the 2A lab, I believe. So you can copy and paste it from there if you want. That's basically what I'm going to do here. I've got it over on this side.
You just like copy and paste it?
You can. So let me just run through real quick how you would do this by hand. So if I'm going to do this by hand, I would say my product test and just tab through. and then when I finally hit enter, that will now have created the row. You'll notice that I didn't enter the product ID. I just let it figure it out, and I hit once I hit enter on the last field, it went ahead and figured it out. I'm going to delete this row. So select it, hit the delete key, get rid of it. What I'm going to do to save some time here, I've got the CSV open. I'm going to select everything except the ID. And then I'm going to go in here. I'm going to actually click up here in this little corner so it selects everything. Paste it. Something did not go quite right. There we go. No. I think what I need to do is select all of it. So Control C, select all of it. There it goes. Okay. Yeah, so I did have to actually select the ID column and paste it in, even though it threw away the IDs.
You have to open that in Excel.
Yeah, you'd want to open that up in Excel and
So
copy
is
paste
the
it from there.
last line with null, or is that just like the enter something?
Oh, yeah. So this line down here, this is not an actual record. If I start typing in there, that would be to create a new record. That last line is create a new record.
How are you getting that?
Pull that down. I had it uploaded as a TXT file because Inside Rankin doesn't allow me to upload CSV files. So if you remove the TXT extension, then it won't work. Yeah, it's under 2 You can grab it from there. Or you can just type it in. Right. But that should get us 10 products in there so that we can just see together to work with. All this data that I have here is basically in the book as well. Yeah, select all of the columns that we want to do.
So you get the idea.
You do need to get the ID. And then click the top left corner. Copy it also.
That's where you put it.
Yeah, you start typing in there and you get a new problem.
Oh, you're right.
Yep. Yep, copy it. Yep. Hit escape. Get out of there. And then you can click up here. If you click in a cell, you can try to put all the data in that one cell. Copy that.
So what is that? Is that the red 35? Yeah, that's the copy.
That one. That was
Would you put it in your bathroom?
What? It's probably cheap too.
Is your IDE?
Easy. Yeah,
Okay, so it is weird because the so I guess it's just like because of the identity keyword.
So you want to go through Office 365 again, and here, and now there's two items. And pull out one, the text one. We want to do this, yeah, use Office.
Yes, you're right.
Go back and sign in. And use your ranking credentials, because ranking's already done. Office 365. I did give instructions and install instructions at the end of the course. That's what go work on it. They got instructions for installing Office 365. If you don't have Office right now installed, ask them, please, your father doing it right now, please copy paste it. This is one reason why I ask people to install Office. Saves time. Yes.
Is it okay if our product IDs are different? Like you have
Yeah. Yeah, so your product IDs, it's fine. And this is what I was talking about. It won't necessarily always start with 1. It won't necessarily always start with, well, it may have gaps, right? This happened on my end because I tried to paste it in initially and it failed. So it reserved numbers 1 through 10 already. Even though there's not a record there, it's already reserved those numbers. So it's starting assigning, and the next row that gets us added would be 20. You have a question?
No, sorry. My
Okay.
hand was just-
Okay. So, yeah.
So are the rows that you pasted in there originally, that you just got deleted, are they still?
They're not there. They're not there. Yeah. If you try to insert a row and it fails somewhere in that process, it still reserves the number, if that makes sense. Even if the row never successfully got inserted, it still reserves that number because it might have gotten at some point it has to reserve it. It has to unfortunately reserve it before it succeeds. Okay, so we have the database there. Now, one thing to note, this here, if I just leave this as is, this doesn't give me a way to give my database to somebody else, right? If I want to give my database to another developer, this doesn't let me do it, right? I've got the database on my own machine, but I can't give it to anybody else. So the way that I do that, the way that I manage that, is using something called a SQL Server project in Visual Studio. So if I go here, I'm going to right click on the solution and say add new project, add new project. Now we're not going to select this project. I'm not doing this one right now. I'm going to go SQL, type that in, search for SQL. I'm going to add a SQL Server database project. Okay, this is the kind of project I want to add. I'm going to call this one SportsStore.database.
can have,
Yes?
you can have space.
No spaces.
No
Don't,
space.
do not use spaces in a project name. Because they will actually be turned into underscores in some places. So you'll have some weird behavior with that. Don't use spaces in your project names. So I'm going to call that SportsStore.database. Hit create. Okay. So this will let me manage that create statement that we created earlier. What we call that the database schema. It's a schema for the database that defines the structure of the database. So I'm going to put the schema into this project. Okay. So first thing I want to do though, just to keep things orderly, is I'm going to create a few different folders. The first folder I'm going to create, I'm going to call that one data. And create another folder, add folder, call it publish. I'm going to add another folder, call it scripts. I'm going to add a final folder and call it tables.
So what are we doing this for?
This is just keeping things, the files organized. Because we're going to have a few different kinds of files. If I don't create these folders, then they're just loose, random files in this project. So this is the way I organize my files. So data, tables, scripts, and publish. Okay. So in the data folder, I'm going to actually add the CSV file that I have so that I have it handy. So I'm going to just drag that in. Oh, no, I can do that differently. So I want to add that CSV file I got. To get there, I'm going to right click on the data folder and say open folder in File Explorer. That will get me here. I'm going to put the file in there. That way I have it somewhere in case I ever need to go back to it. Yes?
Is there a way to update it in the Solution Explorer?
Yep. So if you see in the Solution Explorer, it won't be shown there, right? Put it in this folder. It's not there. So I'm going to hit up on the top here. I'm going to pick the project. There's this little button here for Show All Files. And click that. Show all files. There's some bin and OBJ folders here, but what you'll see is now I can see that product CSV file. It's kind of grayed out.
How do you get it to go in the data folder?
Show all files. So you have to click the project.
I mean to get it into the data folder.
Just drag and drop or copy paste from wherever you have it downloaded. So you need to get it into the data folder. The way I got to that browser is I right-clicked on the data folder and I said Open Folder in File Explorer. That's how I got here. Okay. So the way to include it, I'm going to right-click it and say Include in Project. So it should look like that now, once you've included it in the project. Yeah, ignore that. Let's just write it right on this. So, say include in project. It's fine for it to be there, just we don't want to include it.
Did you get that?
So select the project. You see this button up here?
Yeah.
It's right to the right. Show all files. Yeah, okay. Right click. It's a common thing that happens because oftentimes we want to save files to disk and then add them to our project. But this just gives us a way to go back, and if I need that file, I now have it somewhere that I can find. Okay? That step's not required, but it will help. Okay? The next thing I'm going to do is go actually add the table schema. I'm going to right click on tables, say add. I'm going to add a table. Okay. Right click the tables folder, say add table. It's going to ask you for the name of the table. What is the name of our table? Products. Make sure that you have the S at the end, because our tables, we want them to be plural.
Is it going to be lowercase, like the CSV file? Or?
So uppercase P and then camel case from there. Okay, what I'm going to paste in there though, I'm going to go back to here, back to Management Studio. I'm going to copy that code and I'm just going to put that in here. So that's what I want in my products.sql. Is the same code that we had in Management Studio.
Do we remove the stuff that is already in there?
Yep, you can replace everything that's there. Just throw it away. So this will give us a way to save this and make it very easy to hand it off to another developer, or if I need to push this live, that'll help me with this as well. Or if I need to make changes to the database, this will facilitate that. This is kind of an important tool as far as managing changes to the database. Because without this, we have to do it all manually.
So,
Yep.
I pasted mine, there's like a window down below
Okay.
the top window there.
Yeah, so what you can do if you've got that split view like that, double click on the T-SQL tag and then we'll maximize it. The other side is the design. Yeah, you may have a tab like this that shows up. Usually it's going to kind of show up this way. Typically what I'll do is I just double click on T-SQL to expand that. Yep.
Are we going to be running like stored procedures at some point?
Potentially, we could.
Okay.
I don't currently have planned to do those at the moment. They are a useful tool, but at the moment I don't have a plan for when we're going to do that.
Okay.
The book doesn't cover them.
Oh, really?
The
All
book
right.
does not cover them, but they're worth knowing. So we may look at them at some point, but the book does not cover stored procedures.
Okay.
So that's our table. Okay. Now, just to get you familiar with how we go, let's say we wanted to make a change to that database. Let's say we hadn't created it in Management Studio. One of the things that we want to create is a publish script so that we can in the future make changes to the database. So I'm going to right click on the database project. I'm going to say publish dot dot dot. You're going to get a window like this. Okay. So the first thing we need to do is click this edit button up at the top. And here I want to type in the word localhost. Leave it as Windows authentication. And I want to set this to be SportsStore. Okay. So this is going to say localhost for the server name, Windows authentication, and SportsStore. Okay. Click test connection. Does everybody have that test connection succeeded? Show of hands. Do you have test connection succeeded? Okay, I'm still waiting on a few people. Yeah, should just be SportsStore. Because the name of the project is SportsStore.database, but the name of the actual database is SportsStore. Okay. You have that all good? All right. Okay, so server name needs to be localhost. And then the database name needs to be SportsStore. Hit test connection. You're good. Okay. So I'm going to hit OK on test connection. I'm going to hit OK on this. It will now have put in some information up here. Okay. We'll have put in some information here. The second field I need to specify the name of the database. So SportsStore. Okay. So that first one, it'll have captured, okay, I'm connecting the localhost. Database name is SportsStore. The next thing I need to do in here is name the publish script. Okay. What I want to name this publish script file is just going to be store.sql. Okay. So we've got those filled in. I'm going to, at this point, I'm going to say save profile as. We're going to save it to the publish folder. And I'm going to call it localhost.publish.xml. The reason I'm putting the name of the server in here is because I'm going to have a different publish script, publish configuration based on what server I'm deploying to. So for instance, if you want to deploy IWT Rankin EDU, I would have one for IWT Rankin EDU, right? Or if I want to deploy to my best site, well, I'd have mybestsite.publish.xml. So that's going to have a way to keep track. Usually, honestly, what that means, usually I have localhost, development, and production for the different environments. Things like that as well. Okay. So we saved the profile. We're now going to hit generate script. So generate script is going to generate a SQL script that's going to go ahead, and that script is going to be used to update the database to match what I've created in this project, what I've set up in this project. Okay. Now, this initial script that we created the first time is going to look a little bit different. Okay, it's going to look a little bit different because there's some settings that it's setting up initially. These are some settings that this wants to change, so it has kind of a default, change what the defaults are from SQL Server. Okay, so generating the script, one thing to note, this hasn't run the script yet. I've just generated it, right? So I have this file, but it hasn't actually run it. So all these changes haven't been applied yet. Okay? In order to run it, I need to make sure I hit the execute button. Now remember, what did I say about highlighting text in here? It's only going to run the text you have highlighted. So make sure you don't have anything highlighted when you hit go on that. So say execute. Everything should just say update complete. Okay. Update complete, we're good. Yes?
Where is this script saved at?
It's saved in a temporary folder. Generally, we just throw it away once we're done. They're one-time use scripts, effectively.
So this one, what exactly did that script do for us?
So that script set up some just basic settings about the database. Okay. If I were to now in the future say I wanted to add another column, so I want to add another column to the database, I and type it in here, I can say, I have my script here, localhost.publish.xml. Generate the script. And you'll generate the actual SQL code that I need to run to add that test column. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Would that override the table that we already have created?
Yeah, it would modify it.
Would
Yeah.
it take any of the data away that's already there?
Adding a column wouldn't.
Okay.
Right? Adding a column's not gonna get rid of data. But if I were to drop a column,
So to
that
add
way.
a column, you still use the create table.
no, to drop a column. Okay, so I'm gonna run it first. I would run that script first. That would add the column. Then I'd modify this, generate a new script.
Okay.
I would generate a new script. So if I say let's generate this script, it's going to add the test column. Okay. Run that. I look over here. If I go to select 1,000 rows, you can see there's a test column here now. Right? I want to get rid of that one. So I'm going to get rid of it here. I'm going to publish it again. And you can see it's going to have alter table drop column. That would lose any data that was in that column. Right? Run that, look at it again. Test column's not there. So it allows me to manage changes to the schema by just changing the definition of the table here and then publishing the new definition. It'll figure out what's changed between what's on the server there and what you have in your table definition, which is great, because otherwise you have to manage that by hand. Okay. So I've got that definition set up. So what we should have here, product CSV under the data folder. I have a products.sql here under the tables folder, and I have a localhost.publish.xml. Okay? Everybody have that? Hands up if you have that structure set up.
Actually, I have trouble getting that under the data folder.
Okay?
Getting that. Right click. Hit open file in products folder.
Oh, it's there. Okay. So what you select the project?
Oh, we built it.
No. There, show all files.
Oh,
So now you can see all the files that are actually there. Right click it, and you just say on table project.
oh, okay.
So now it's part of the project. Now it goes in there.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I remember the picture, this is saying, like, there's something
Yeah.
that's gonna publish.
That's fine. You can just say include the project, so that's not.
So that's how I'm going to set up that project. So data, I just have, hey, here's some data files I need to keep track of. That CSV file is actually completely ignored by Visual Studio. It's just like, oh, this is a loose file. I don't know what to do with it. It won't actually do anything with it. So it's just a way to keep track of that. Okay, I've got the schema. I've got my publish script. So that's the basic setup there. Now, the next thing I want to do, I've got it in the database, but I'm not actually using it in the application yet. Okay? So to do that, I need to bring in another dependency, right? Do you remember what tool we had to do to bring in Bootstrap at the beginning of this? What was the name of that? Nuget. Okay? We needed to use Nuget. So let's go right-click on the project, say Manage Nuget Packages. And this is again on the SportsStore project. I don't want to do this on the database project. I'm going to go to Browse and look for Entity Framework. If I just type in entity, that should be enough to find it. Entity Framework. This is the one we want. 6.20. We're going to say install. Accept. Okay. Entity Framework is what we're going to use to actually connect to the database. It's what we call an ORM, Object Relational Model. What it does is it takes the database, which lives in the language of SQL, right? Database lives in the language of SQL, and turns it into C# objects. So using Entity Framework, we won't actually have to write SQL, we'll just write C# to manipulate the database.
Version 6.2.
6.2.0. That's what you should have. It should be the latest version. Okay, so we've added that in. Make sure we hit Save All. We want to now go to our Models folder. So right-click on Models and say Add. We're going to say Add New Item. Go to Data. We'll have a few options here. So under Add New Item, we're going to go to that Data folder. Okay. Now, one thing to be fair, just to be fair, forewarned, I make this mistake myself. It looks like I might want to go through here. EF 6x, EF 5x. You think that that's the option you want to pick here. Because I do want to create a DB context. Okay? Those are the wrong options. You don't want to click those, they don't work. Okay. It looks like that's the way you would go. Don't go through there, it won't work. You'll end up having to undo a few things. It will be kind of messy. Okay. That's not the way we actually create it. So we need to go here, ADO.NET, Entity Data Model. I want to make sure I give this a name. The name of this is going to end up being the class of the thing that kind of represents our connection to the database. So make sure you get this name right, because otherwise you're going to have to delete it and start over. I'm going to call this SportsStore. Actually, let me just double check what name did I use over here. Yep. So SportsStore database, no dot. SportsStore database, no dot. Say add. It's going to give me 4 options here. Okay? It's going to give me 4 options here. Now, the thing to know with Entity Framework, there's 2 different ways to work with Entity Framework. And they're kind of laid out in a grid. So I have 4 different ways to use them. Okay? When I'm working with Entity Framework, one option I can do is what's called design first. Okay? Design first. Okay? That uses a file with the extension of EDMX. Uses an EDMX file. Okay? The way that works is it gives me kind of a graphical way to work with the database connection. Okay? So that's design first. The other way to work with this is called code first. And in this case, I'm just going to have C#. I'm just going to have CS files. Okay? So this is a kind of graphical way of working with the database. This is a code way of working with the database. Okay? Note, however, there are 4 options here. Okay? These 4 options fall into 4 different buckets. So if I'm starting empty, there's no database, or I can say I have database first.
Okay? So if I don't have a database created already, or I have a database already, okay? Do I have a database? Do I have a database? Do I not have a database? Well, let me ask you at this point, do we have a database? We already have one. We already created one, right? It's just the way that I would recommend you do is I would recommend always starting with the database first. Okay? So you have these options. This first one would be start, I don't have a database, I'm going to create the design, and then that design is going to create the database. Here I'm going to create the code. The code is going to create the database. Okay? Those are two options that exist there. Okay? And those are two of the options up there. Yep.
What if you have you don't have data in the database, you still?
If you have the schema, if you have the definition of those tables, then you have a database. Doesn't matter whether or not there's data in there, but if you know what the tables are, then you should treat it as you have a database. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Whether or not you have data actually in it is not the part that matters. What matters is that you already have a schema. Okay? So assuming we already have a schema, we're going to pick one of these two options. So one option is say, hey, I already have a database, I want to do it in design mode. Or I already have a database, I want to do it in code mode. Okay? Now, switching between these two, that's something you can change after you've created it. You can change your mind on it. Switching between design first and code first is something you can't change. Once you've picked, you're stuck with it, basically. Okay? Once you've picked, it's a real pain in the ass to try and switch between design first and code first, or code first and design first. They work very differently. Okay? Learn to earn, which version are we on?
We're on design first.
We're on design first. We're over here. I kind of wish we were on that one, but the person who created the project created everything. Well, what we're going to do this semester is we're going to go through code first. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say code first from a database, right? So code first from a database because I want to do the code first path and I already have a database. So that's the pathway that we're going to use. Okay, let's hit next. You're going to see there's a drop down here, nothing's in it. I'm going to say new connection. And that should pop up a prompt. Here we go. I'm going to say Microsoft SQL Server. I'm going to get this window. What I want to enter for the server name is localhost. Let me forewarn you, don't hit that drop down.
I just
don't hit that drop down. Because as soon as you hit that drop down, it's going to go look at all the machines on your network and try to figure out all the machines that are currently on your network. Don't hit that drop down. You'll be sitting there for a minute waiting for it to populate that list. Okay, so just type in localhost. Here's one thing to know. Localhost won't be in that drop down. What will be in that drop down is the machine names of computers that are on your network. So type in localhost. Okay. What I want to then pick is Windows Authentication, just like we did earlier. And now this drop down's okay. I can pick SportsStore. So I connect to localhost using Windows Authentication, and I want the SportsStore database. Okay. We can hit test connection just like we did previously. That's all good. Let's hit OK. You should have something like this. There's a random string up here. Don't worry about that. But what I do want to make sure I set down here is I want to make sure that that says SportsStore database and that box is checked. This is going to save it as it says, save it in the web config file. I need that in order to be able to run this on any other computers. If you don't have this checked, if you don't have this set up this way, I won't be able to run this when I try to run your application on my computer.
if you don't get this way. Okay, we're going to get to this screen now. Okay, you see that says tables and views. What it's going to look at and show us is the tables that already exist there. Okay, so what I want to check is the tables that I want to include. Okay, fair forewarning, if I click up here, that's going to try to select all the tables. You don't want to do that, because there will be some tables in the future that we want to exclude. There will be some tables in the future that we want to exclude from our model. Okay.
For some reason, products isn't coming up on
It's probably because whatever's on your screen previous was wrong.
No, you gotta click the drop down.
Yeah, click expand. There it is. Yeah, so check products. So I'm going to say we want to include the products table. Now, there's this checkbox down here. It says pluralize or singularize generated object names. Okay, we do want that checked at this point. The standard with Entity Framework, the normal expectation with Entity Framework, is that all of your tables should be plural and that all of your model classes should be singular. Okay, so the name of the table is products, but the name of our model class will be product, right? Singular versus plural. That's not necessarily required, but to change that behavior, you actually have to change some code. You have to put some code. You have to put in a line of code to get Entity Framework to stop doing that. Okay, because otherwise it will make that expectation that the name of your tables are plural. That if you're working with an existing table out there, it's not uncommon that some existing databases maybe have their table names singular. Okay, so in that case you may want to know how to change that, right? But fair forewarning, there are databases out there where the table names are singular.
Is there going to be a setup guide for all this?
I am recording it as we're going through here, so there's a video recording from today, and I'll post that up. This stuff's also relatively easy to find, mostly online, disregarding setting up the SQL Server project. That SQL Server project I haven't found a good resource for, but setting up the context like this, there's good resources for. Yep.
This might be completely unrelated to what we're actually doing, but like, what's the difference between like what we're setting up here and like manually coding like an SQL connection, like in our code? Like what are we doing here that's different? And I know that's probably a big question to ask.
Yeah, it's not a question I can answer right now. Can I ask that towards the end of class?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, because I think you need to see the code that we're going to write before I need to actually write some code before I can explain that.
Okay.
Because my answer wouldn't make sense at this point. So let me hit finish on this. Okay. That's done. If I look over under models now, you should have two classes under models. One should be named SportsStore Database. The other one should be Product. Yes?
You got this pop-up.
Say yes to all.
Okay.
Yes to all. Because what's happened is when you generated that, it actually changed your product class. So you're going to say yes to all to let it refresh what's actually there.
Oh, wow.
You want to change that to SportsStore database if it's a sports team. You have to rename it now or themselves.
Yeah, so rename it to SportsStore Database. So it has changed. It has changed our model class. We'll actually want to do another thing there too, but it has changed our model class. So let's look real quick though that this file that it's created. So it's created a file called SportsStore Database. You'll notice here that it is a subclass of DB context. Okay. DB context is the base class for any framework to get a connection to the database. If If you want a connection to the database, you need a DB context. Without a DB context, you don't get any connection. That's where everything starts. Okay? So DB context is our base class here. What's this? Yes? It's a constructor. Yes. Okay, so this is a constructor. It's calling the base class constructor. It's saying name equals SportsStore database. That tells it the name of the connection string. Okay? The name of the connection string. That's going to enable it to figure out what the connection details are, how to get to the actual database. What the connection details are. So that's what that's for. Next thing we'll have here. You're going to see one of these for each table we have. So we have a products table. The name of the variable is going to be products. The type of that, property. We're going to have products property. The type of that product is a DB set of products. Does that make sense? DB set is the way that we represent a table. Okay, so a DB context is a database. A DB set is a table. Okay. You'll notice a bunch of different keywords on here. Virtual is there so that we can subclass this for testing purposes and chain and do any behavior we need to do that. That's for testing. This partial here, partial is a way of saying I want to have more than one class file and kind of merge them together into one class. That's put there because oftentimes that's something that comes up and you may need. We can, if you want, you can remove that keyword. It won't matter for the stuff we're going to do in this class. But it's there. You won't need to necessarily worry about the details of that. Now, this down here. Protected override. What does that override keyword mean? Remember what that means?
It overrides the base class.
Overrides the base class. Okay.
The method.
Yep. So what does that mean? What else does that mean?
It gives unique functionality to the subclass based
Okay.
off necessity.
Okay. Doesn't it also mean that the base class has an on-model creating method? Right? If I looked at DB context, I would see an on-model creating method.
And it has like the virtual keyword, right?
Yeah, it would have the virtual keyword. Virtual saying that it can be overridden. Okay? So we've overridden it, we've changed how it behaves. Okay? This part here is what we call the Fluent API. This is the entity framework Fluent API. The Fluent API is to set certain things that we can't set through the attributes. Like we set the required attribute. Some things we can't set that way, so it's to set additional details. But we can also sometimes use this as opposed to the attributes. They're actually kind of a trade-off between those two. So what this is saying is that, okay, we've got the product class. This is our model class. It's got a property price, and we're going to tell it that it has this precision, 16.2. Remember where that came from? That came from because when we created the database, it was decimal 16.2. This is unfortunately the only way to specify the precision of a decimal type.
Well, why would it do that to like the charge, like the 500, like the only
Because we're gonna do that a different way.
Okay.
We'll see that just a second. Okay. So that's what that is doing. It's specifying the precision of that decimal is 16.2. Okay. Back over in the world of the product class, you'll see that it's changed a few things, right? Remember when we initially created this model, we didn't put any attributes on it? Okay. So it's gone ahead and put the required attributes on these three. It's gone ahead and put string length as well. So we have required. Required says this has to be here. Required is necessary when you have a column that's not null. So if it's not null in the database, then it should also be marked required in your model. Does that make sense? If it's not null in the database, it should also be more required in your model. If it has like this, remember we put it nvarchar 100, saying string length 100. this says the maximum length of a string here is 100. It'll actually give us error messages in the front end just like the required attribute does. If I try to put something that's longer than 100, it'll say you can't do this, it's too long. Now, the error messages are not user-friendly, so I typically want to configure those. Okay? I typically want to set those up to be something that gives a user-friendly message. So remember how I might do that. If I go into here, I can say error message name is required, or I might say product name is required, right? I can do a similar thing here. I can say comma, error message what I put there, that's really subjective. That's going to be based on whatever makes sense. So that's the message that it's going to show the user. Wherever I put here that's the message it's going to show the user if they do something wrong. If they do something invalid. Okay, so usually I want to configure those things. Okay, another attribute that I tend to suggest to add here is one called key. We're going to add this to the primary key. So that's to give it a hint that, oh, by the way, this is the primary key for this table. What is what?
Foreign key.
I can't hear you. What? For key?
Foreign.
Foreign key. Something we're not going to get to right now. Foreign key has to do with linking tables. So I'm just going to do key. Key says it's a primary key. Foreign key would be a different kind of key. I am going to go ahead and add the required field down here because I want to be able to show an error message saying, hey, you did this. You know, you need to fill in this field. So does that make sense? In reality, I'd add the error message, all these, but I'm just going to add it to those two just for demonstration purposes.
Not too much, but like, so you have two different error messages for name. When you show it in the view.
Yep.
How would you differentiate between those?
So if they leave the field completely blank, right, that would show this error message. If they leave the field completely blank, it would show the required error message. If they put in a string that's 200 characters long, okay, they filled it in, they've given me a value, but it's too long, so I was going to get that second error message. Right? So if it's 200 characters, I'm going to get that error message. If it's 0 characters, I'm going to get that one.
When you generated yours, was price already, you had the required attribute on it?
No, it didn't. I added that. I added the required attribute to that. So that's our model. We've got our model set up. It's gone ahead and changed those. Okay? And I hope you can see this is part of why we wanted to start and use those model classes, right? This is part of why we need those, is because that's going to lead us into connecting to the database. Okay? So I've got a SportsStore database class, and I have a product class. Let's go and build the actual controller. So I want to go back to product controller. Okay? Remember what I had here. Initially I had hard-coded the list of products. Okay? What I want to do instead is pull them from the database. So pulling from the database, I'm going to replace that list with this line of code. I'm going to create a field, private SportsStore database underscore DB equals new SportsStore database. That's going to give us the connection that we need to access the database. Okay.
So, sorry, can you say what that does again?
This is going to give us connection to the database, right? So underscore DB now represents the database effectively. Okay.
And so that's the class or model inside the models.
Yeah. Yeah. That's the class that we just created. So DB. Now, remember that SportsStore database class that we created had a DB set called products. I can now refer to that table using underscore DB.products. That DB set looks like a list. It's not exactly a list, but it looks like a list, okay? So I can actually pass it directly to the view, and it will be able to iterate through it, okay?
So that DB set represents the entire table?
No, it represents the entire database.
Okay.
.products represents the table.
So products is passing that products.sql.
So
that's giving all this
yes, yeah, those are connected. So product.cs is connected to products.cs. Okay. So remember, we put 10 products into our database. Here's all the code that we really need to talk to it and pull it down. So let me go run this. I now have 10 products showing up. I didn't have to change my view. I just had to make a change to my controller and replace that list with this DB set. DB set implements IONumerable, so we're good.
This is kind of off topic, but are you allowed to store images in a database?
You really shouldn't. There are ways to, but you really shouldn't. You generally should store them as files.
So you kind of, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
You kind of answered the question I had previously.
Okay. Yes.
Right.
So this is all the code I have to write to connect to the database.
Yeah.
So I don't really have to write a lot. That makes sense?
Absolutely.
The previous version to Entity Framework and what this is built on top of is something called ADO.net. ADO.net took quite a bit more code to connect to the database and do things. So this shortened things up a lot using an ORM. Okay. So the next thing I want to do, I've got that. The next thing I want to do, well, there's 10 items. I'm showing everything from the database, right? Right now I'm showing every single item that's there on the page, right? So if I had 1 million records, this would say, grab all those 1 million records, show them on a page. That might be pretty slow to load, right? So what's one of those tricks that we use to not show all the results initially?
Like a dot take.
Oh, I was going to say link.
Okay, we are going to use take, we are going to use link. There's a more generic term that we use, even if we weren't using, from a user standpoint, what does that usually look like? How many search results do you get when you go to Google?
1 million.
On the first screen, on the first page. Remember, there's paging. Remember, there's paging. We page the results, okay? So the first page of results from Google has 10 results. The next page has 10 results, and 10 results, and 10 results, right? We page, rather than showing all of those million records on one page, we split it up into individual pages, right? So the way to do that is we need to write a little bit of link in here, yes, to do that. First thing I'm going to do is add some input parameters. So the first parameter is going to be the page number. The second one's going to be the page size. So I want page 1, page size is equal to 4. Okay? Those equals, that says default values. So if the user doesn't give us a value, we're going to pick the first page. If the user doesn't tell us how big we want the pages, we're going to show 4 items per page. So that gives us defaults. Okay? The next thing I want to do is get that individual page. So I'm going to need to write a little bit of link to do that. So I'm going to say list product So that's the end result I want to get into. I'm going to do some link, but I need it to end up as a list of products. Okay? But this time I'm going to end up with a list of products that not all 10 of them, but just the first 4 of them. Okay? So I'm going to say underscore db dot products, just like we started previously. I'm going to say order them. I need to make sure if I'm paging them, I have to order them by something. Otherwise, I'll get them back in a random order, and that order may change from page to page to page, right? That would be a big problem. If I go to page 2 and then all of a sudden they're in a random different order than they were, well, that's a problem. So I want to make sure I order them by something sensical. When I'm going to order them, I'm going to order them alphabetically. I'm going to order them alphabetically by name.
I feel like ordering them by category could also work.
It could. It could. But the reason I'm going to order them by name, that's usually what users expect. Plus, I'm not going to be showing the category on the actual item, so it would be kind of weird. So I'm going to order them by name. Okay. The next thing I need to do is put in skip. I'm going to put a little formula in here, page -1 times the page size. And come back to that. And I'm going to say take page size. Okay, last thing I need to do is turn this into a list, because up to this point it's still IEnumerable. And there I've got my page. So DB products, order them by name, skip a certain number of items, and then take the page size. Turn that to a list. Okay. Another thing to remember that we need to do, we need to actually pass this variable to the view. So make sure that you update that to be products down here, not underscore db.products, or you'll still see everything. Okay. Yes.
I am getting an error.
Oh, maybe it's probably as well. Yes, initially we should get the first 4 alphabetically. Your formula is probably
Why does it say?
You have the page -1.
Page -1 times the page size.
Page -1, so that's page 1.
Yes, it does. because the order of operations matters quite a bit. Okay? So again, ordering it by just gives us a sensible ordering, predictable ordering. This page -1, okay? Remember, I'm starting at page 1, right? So the reason I'm saying -1 is to shift the first page basically to 0, right? Because the first page should have all the first results on it, right? If I just put page here, I would be skipping the first 4 results. Okay? So that's why there's a -1 there, and that's why that needs to happen first. Okay? The next thing here, notice I'm saying page size, right? So when you say for each page that I'm on, past the first, I can skip that many items, right? So if I'm on page 1, I skip no items. Page 2, I skip 4 items. Page 3, I skip 8 items, 12, etc. Right? So that's where that time sits there. I need to say skip the number of items from all the previous pages. Dalton? Okay. Okay. So skip all the items from the previous pages, and then take up to the page size. Take up to 4 items. If there's not 4 items available, you'll just grab whatever's left, right? So that last page might only have 1 or 2 items on it. This will go ahead and take care of that. It's just a limit. So it's not always guaranteed that you're going to get 4 items back. It may be 4 items or less. Okay, it just says that's the most you can get back. Do you have a question, Caleb?
No, it's going to take a picture of the screen.
Okay.
Let's take good time for a break.
Yeah, let's go ahead and do that, come back at 4. We're running long today, so we'll probably finish up part of this tomorrow, but that's fine.
We have end page equals 1 and end page size equals 4. Why would you put those inside of why would you make those arguments and not just like variables inside of the method?
Because I want to be able to pass these in via the URL.
Okay. Oh, okay. So when you actually click a button,
So I want to be able to type those in, which we'll do that immediately when we get back. So let's say you put in question mark, page equals 2.
Oh,
That's page 2. Or if I wanted to say page size is equal to 3.
Oh, page size.
So by putting those in as parameters, I can now pass in values.
And I guess we'll do that by making buttons.
Yes.
All right, cool.
Yes, we'll make buttons and drop downs and things like that to go through them. But I need those there to take those inputs.
Right. And is that what you have this code from? Okay.
Yeah, that's the create the magic buttons.
And one more other kind of a stupid question, actually. So when we made,
Which you probably
right, when it changed to this for the database stuff, why did it put the user statements inside of namespace? It's just weird.
It's just a way to generate the code. You can move them out and do that thing in the same
Oh, okay. Interesting. Okay.
The only reason why that would make any difference is if you had more than one namespace in the same file.
Oh, okay.
If you start putting more than one class, and this class is in this namespace, this class is in that namespace.
Yeah.
But why it does that here, the way it generates the code, I don't understand. That's how it generated the code. So, the better or worse. That'll give you a whole lot this week. That's pretty cool. There's a lot that this is doing. I mean, when I learned how to use databases initially, this took a few hundred more lines of code to do the same thing. So this makes things a lot simpler.
I was looking at it, and Mr. G had us do a project, trying to question me, like, So a lot of that stuff is what he told us to use in 100, and I was just like, what? You know, I was like, what is this?
Just a little bit of backstory there. I already worked with Mr. Chiefly about their final project.
Okay.
So I had some input on that, knowing you guys were going to do this in that semester.
And I was just like looking up on Google every YouTube videos, just trying to find exactly what this was talking about. And it was like, okay, oh.
Yes, this has to do with paging. This has to do with paging. This is stuff that that's part of my head we should talk about. Because this relates directly to what we're doing here.
Yeah, I think some stuff with DB, like databases and stuff. On the final, but I use like SQL. So in my code, it was like,
Link.
yeah.
These are link extensions. This is still part of the link, but it's not the query syntax. It's the functions. The thing to know there, the query language, while useful, it doesn't actually have everything. So you usually end up, even if you're using the query language, you have to, whether or not you're using the query language or not, I usually end up using a little bit of query language, a little bit of extension methods. Skip, take, to list, none of those exist in the query language. I can do border line in the SQL syntax, but I can't do skip, take, or to list, all of that's really the biggest thing the query language is better for is for joins. Joins are really, really hard to read as far as the method syntaxes goes. But
Join method.
joins, which is putting two tables together.
Oh.
Joins are great for using that query language, but until you have more than a table, you're just using the methods. Oh.
Yeah. So then initially I had it, like something like that.
Yeah, because if I remember, I think I need to hand connect to Access.
I had it working at one point, but this would be wanting me to go back to like link. Or,
Yeah, the hope was to have you just do it with a list, and then use the link method to click back and try to keep that kind of stuff simple.
Should I just delete Visual Studio 2017?
Yeah, you can.
Okay. Sometimes in files it will try to open.
Yeah, you may be better off just uninstalling too. Don't do that in Classic either because basically what we do is just speak about it. But yeah, you can uninstall them. At this point, we're using 2019 this whole semester, and then next semester we'll have it first. So everybody can do these years. Everything's coming along. Everything working? Yeah.
Up to the SQL Server stuff.
Okay. You kind of follow along the way with the way I've done things, usually a bit different. Because I want to get away from usually like repository inject. Okay, good. Is the database project in there too? No, I'm going to do all that when I get home. But
Don't want to overload the computer yet. Okay. Well, it didn't start smoking, so that's awesome.
That is promising.
Now when I get my new computer, I probably will load this thing
That
fire.
being said, I mean, I think I've had 2 or 3 hard drives sold that more than we, of course, have been using computers, and none of them have smoked. So
That'd be kind of funny. It's that Aston raises his hand. Mr. Smith, my computer caught fire.
That would not be fun.
that would not be fun.
That's right. Well, just to see the reaction.
I would hate my life after that. I would literally hate my life.
I mean, I have smelled smoke.
You smell burning.
I've smelled smoke coming into the community before, but I've never seen smoke. That's a whole other world of like you're
It's like throw it out the window.
no, it's take the whole thing apart, figure out what part is on fire and replace that part. Even if it's on fire, it's probably not the whole thing that's on fire.
Hopefully.
If you catch it soon enough. Unplug it from the wall, good place to start.
You better. She's down to your options. Yeah, I know she almost never makes it. So I'm going down to one option. Give her.
There you go.
It's a lot of people that. Yeah, I spent 2 hours like that cleaning the Speaking of which, let's see what she said this time.
I wonder if I could drive home that way. I brought 3 random collections. They pretty much always are. They have no solution yet.
Seems, or it sounds like it's like almost like slave labor, like they're pushing them pretty tough, like
I don't know that Amazon is the place that they necessarily want to work. I'm not sure.
Well, especially in the package handling part of.
Oh, well, yeah, definitely not. They got that too.
In the factory thing.
Slave labor.
Well, it's like they have this thing
Yeah,
where
that was it, yeah.
you keep track of how long your whole line are working or something like that. So then like I guess those people they're like knocking at the bathrooms and stuff so they can make better time. And you get like this whole thing.
Identifiers are awesome.
Sounded like it's not very good. It doesn't sound like a nice place to work.
It's like a Linux-based operating system. So Python is the biggest support.
Bro, I tried and I could not get it to work. I couldn't get the internet to work.
Yeah. You get the high
Dude, I tried three different ones and they all I didn't have enough power on
The
them.
Raspberry Pi 4 is actually so cheap.
I have experience working in factories, so whenever I do my job, I would say,
That's like one of the main things that come with that.
If you do get one, I hope that they give them like brand because the one I got, the one I got, I couldn't use my mouse or keyboard because it wouldn't hold enough juice.
How much was the Pi 4? Yeah, they're still really cheap.
Yeah, you need a good battery.
That's it. Okay. So, we're definitely not going to get all this done today. That's okay. We've got some flex between this week because we just want to go 7, 8, and 9. So, if we run a little bit long today, we'll still cut it off at 4:30. We'll just jump back into it tomorrow and resume where we left off. So, we've got this set up. If I run the program, we should now see that we get just the first page of results. Okay, so I get the first 4 items, first page. Now, right now, there is no way for the user to just click a button and go to the next page, right? That's what our goal is, but we're not quite there yet. But let me show what we do have. So, in the URL, in the address bar up here, I can start typing in characters. So I'm going to type in, at the end of this, I'm going to type in question mark, page equals 2. And look at what it's done. It's gone and taken me to the second page of results. Similarly, I can put in pages 3, and it's got the third page of results.
Where does that come from?
Well, let's look at our controller. What did I just put in the action method? I've got 2 parameters to this action method. One is called page and one is called page size. So I can pass those in as what we call query parameters. They're part of the query.
So is it the question mark that accesses that parameter or like references it?
So anytime you have question mark in a URL, you're now saying that you're passing values that are query parameters. So page is equal to 3.
So what if we did the same thing with page size then?
Yes. So I can say page size is equal to 2, and I've got pages that have 2 items per page. If I want to say combine those things, I can say page size is equal to 2 and ampersand page is equal to 3, and I've got the third page 2 items per page. So just by putting those parameters right in the index method, I can now pass those in as query parameters. Okay, I can pass those in as query parameters. Now I want to do something quick to make that easier. I want to do 2 things to make that easier. I want to give them buttons, but I also want to make these URLs easier to read, right? Because question mark pages 3, question mark pages 2, those kind of things, they work, but they're not terribly readable, right? Remember I told us maybe in chapter 1, chapter 3, we talked about the idea that you can do routing in MVC. So let's go set up a route that's going to be more user-friendly. So I'm going to go over to app start, the route config file. I'm going to put in some additional code. So I'm going to keep the code I have down here. So I have ignore route up top. I still have this existing default route. I'm going to add in this clause right here. So map route name is null, URL is page, curly brackets page. The defaults are controller equals product and action equals list. What this is going to let me do, rather than doing the question mark pages 2, I can do slash page 2. And that will get me to page 2. Or slash page 3 will get me to page 3.
So we don't need the ID, we don't need any ID on that one?
No, no ID. The default says take that to controller product, take that action list. But it says any URL that matches this pattern, page 2, page 3, page 1, you want to send it to the controller with those values. Everybody run it on your program. You look at it in the browser, and at the end of the URL, enter slash page 2. I'm going to run this. No, slash page 2. There we go. Just like that. Yes.
So in the URL section of the route method,
yeah.
The page or the second page, the lowercase and curly bracket, that's the
variable.
Variable name.
That's the variable name.
So how come you wouldn't do this in the controller?
What do you mean I wouldn't do this in the controller?
Like, you know how we usually say, like, what, like where to go, like, in the controller? Like, I don't know if I explained it.
Okay. Well, this is how we get to that. So page, if I type in page 1, you can see page 1, page 2, page 3. So we're seeing that, right? The old format still works. So if I want to say question mark page equals 2, that still works. We didn't break that. That still works. We just added a shorter way to get there. Okay? Because what happens is I type in this page 2, right? So I type in page 2. The order of these routes matters. The order of these routes matters a lot. If I switch the order of these two into another order, it won't work. Okay? It's critical that they're in this order. Because what it does is it processes them from the top to the bottom. So it's going to start up at the top and say, okay, you gave me page 2. Does that match this pattern here that I have under URL? Well, it says, okay, it's the word page followed by something else. It matches that pattern. Let's use that route. Okay? If it doesn't start with page, it's going to use this route. Does that make sense? If the URL doesn't start with page, it's going to use this route where we say home index or product list. Does that make sense? It doesn't match that pattern. So, but it matches this pattern, so it says, okay, page, and then take the part after that and turn that into the page variable. So I'm going to pass to the controller. So it goes to the controller, that index method says page. Okay, well they gave me page 2, so I'm going to set page equal to 2. Page 3, we're going to set page equal to 3. So it chops off that part of the URL and says just pass that in as a parameter. So this is what we call a pattern, right? I'm telling it the pattern of URL to treat this way. That make sense?
And then because the defaults are on a product and list, if we were in another controller per se, and we try to do that page 2, it just wouldn't
work because
right.
We had another controller there. We need to do something more fancy.
Okay.
Right. So /page2 only sends me to that controller and that action. Right. If I wanted to do page 2 with some other item, I need to be more fancy with my route configuration. Does that make sense? If I have more than one controller, I'm going to have to be more fancy with this route. Okay? Yes?
Positive, but my page was lowercase, and it still worked.
Yep. Yep. The URLs actually, as far as MVC is concerned, are usually case insensitive. Not always. As long as you're running on a Windows machine, they should be case insensitive. But if somewhere in the process you have a Linux machine or a Linux file system, you may see that it ends up being case sensitive. Okay. So generally I advise people to still respect the case, just because you don't know when you actually deploy it, if you'll have a Linux system in there somewhere that will make it case sensitive. But typically speaking, especially running locally, when you're testing it, it's going to be completely case insensitive. Okay. So that makes it easier to get to those pages. It means that we have more descriptive URLs, right? That way, if somebody were to share it online or something, we're going to have more descriptive sort of URL there. That's all that does. Okay. Now, we want to add those buttons. The way we're going to add those buttons, I'm going to create my own HTML helper. Remember, we've already seen some HTML helpers, right? We've seen text box for, we've seen begin form. What I want to do is add another method to there, okay? Well, the class that's used there is the HTML helper class. So that's the class that I need to extend, okay? To do that, I need to write a decent amount of code, so bear with me on that. What I'm going to do to the first thing I'm going to do, SportsStore, I'm going to add a new folder. I'm going to call that folder HTML helpers. Okay, so I have the HTML helpers folder. Okay. Inside of the HTML helpers folder, I'm going to add a class, and I'm going to call it paging helpers. Okay. When I create this class, it'll look like this. Okay. You'll notice the namespace is SportsStore.html helpers. It's .html helpers because I put it in the HTML helpers folder. Okay. Now, if I leave it as that, MVC won't actually be able to find it easily. Okay. I'll have to put a using anytime I want to use this if I leave it as that namespace. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to remove that part and put it in the SportsStore namespace, because then it'll be able to find it automatically. So even though I put it in the paging helpers, the HTML helpers folder, I want it to not have that namespace.
So where did you put the HTML helpers folder?
I put it just at the root. It's in the SportsStore project. So it's the same level as controllers, models. It's just another folder called HTML helpers. Okay. Normally I would recommend to you that it's good to only have one class in a file. Normally that's a good thing to do. Okay. You are actually allowed to have as many classes in a file as you want to. And in this case, I'm going to do that because it's going to make things easier. Because otherwise I would have to create 3 files for this. Okay? So I'm actually going to put all 3 of these classes basically into this file. So the first class that I need is one called paging info. Public class paging info. I'm going to add 3 properties to that. This is going to track the information about which page the user's on and how many pages there are. Why is that one over there? So I've got paging info. It's got 3 numbers there. Total items, items per page, current page. Okay. So total items is going to keep track of how many items are there completely, are there total in the database. So in this case that will be 10. There's 10 items total. Items per page is going to be how many items are we going to show on each page. So that'd be 4, right? 4 items per page. And current page is which page are we on. So page 1, page 2, page 3. I need that information to be able to set up these links and know which page you're on. Okay? So this is just data. Data we need for our model. Okay? I'm going to add another property in here. This is not an auto-implemented property. I'm going to call it total pages. It's going to calculate the number of pages that there are. This class is found on page 180, or something similar to it is on 180. The formula I'm using here is a little bit different. Once you get to it, you know why it's different. This one, okay. This one here, that's it. You should be happy now. That's inside of us. You're outside of So we've got paging info class that's got this property. So if I look at the textbook, page 180, it has this formula here. This is actually, let's look at what this formula is doing. So the whole point is we want to calculate how many pages there are. Okay? So it says take the number of pages, total items, divide that by the number of pages, math.ceiling. What does math.ceiling do? Rounds up. Huh?
I thought it chops off.
No. It rounds up. So it rounds up when we're using floating point arithmetic. It will round up to the closest integer. Okay? Because that's what I want to do. Let's say, because I have 10 items, right? 10 items, 4 items per page. I should have 3 pages, right? I should have 3 pages. For 9 items, I have 3 pages. If I round down, how many pages do I end up with? Well, I end up with 2, right? If I round out, I get 2 pages instead of 3, which means my last few items that don't have a full page, the user won't even be able to see them, right? So it's critical that I round up, because otherwise, as far as the user is concerned, those items don't even exist. They can't get to them. Okay. So rounding up. Now, notice that total items and items per page, they're both type integer, right? They're both type integer. So if I just said, hey, let's do total divided by the number per page, right? If I just did those 2 things, just the division without all the extra fancy stuff here, I would be missing a page, because by default, integer division rounds down, right? Integer division rounds down. Or as you were saying, truncates, right? So if I have if this comes out as 2.5 pages, it will just come out as 2, right? Because integer division rounds down by default, okay? So this is one way to try and solve that problem. Let's say, well, integer division always rounds down, so let's use floating point division. Let's change total items and items per page, we'll change them to a decimal type, round it down, and then turn them back to an integer type. Is there anything that can go wrong there? Is there anything that can go wrong there? There's a lot that can go wrong, right? I'm taking an integer, turning it into a floating point number, and then turning it back to an integer. That's a recipe for a lot of rounding error. Okay, so that's not what we want to do when we want to do calculations like this. Okay, so there is a trick, and let me be fair. Most developers make this mistake. Most developers don't know that there's a different way. So I don't fault the author of the book any for making that mistake as well, because I've seen a lot of professional developers make that mistake. This is how we want to do it. The trick here, if I didn't have this part here, right? If I just said total items divide items per page, that would be rounding down. Adding this little bit here, items per page -1, that makes it round up, right? So if items per page is 4, right, I add 3 and then divide by 4. That makes it round up. That's the magic sauce to make it round up. And what's important there is I've never gone over to floating point. This is staying in integers. right? This whole expression here never has to change it over to a floating point number, which means I don't have rounding error. This is perfectly accurate. Yeah. So if you ever have integer division, you need to round up. That's the trick to do it. 1 minus the divisor. So I'm dividing by 4. If I'm dividing by 4, I add 3. Adding 3 is the trick. If I'm dividing by 16, I add 15. That's all you have to do to get it to round up. Okay? Next thing I need to do. I want to... Huh?
426.
Okay, so let's call that, and we'll finish this class up tomorrow. Okay, are there any questions before we break?
Should we save any of the thing we did on the SQL Server, like?
Everything we did in SQL Server, I mean, you should already have the schema here.
Oh, okay, so.
Right, all we cared about is the products table.
So we didn't say that.
Yep. As soon as you've got this, assuming you've got this products.sql already, you don't need to say what's over on their SQL server, on SQL. So we'll resume tomorrow and finish up this paging helpers.